Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested we meet up in person. She invited me to this coffee shop, and I accepted. However, the day of, she started messaging me, saying she had something to tell me. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed that he really liked talking to me though, and begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and just continued on with my life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed cool and fun, and we hit it off right away. She asked me if I spoke to other people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. Weeks later, I would realize that this new girl was the same girl as the week before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure, as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe, and the next day I sat at the table waiting. 5, then 10, then 15 minutes had passed, and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out of the window, and saw, from across the street, a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds, and looked back, but he was still just standing there, staring. At that point, I left the cafe, got on my bike, and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together and reasoned that no one could have followed me. Then I deleted my Tinder profile, and things were normal for a few weeks. About 3 weeks later, I started getting these phone calls. The numbers always showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out. After about a day, I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. Then, I started receiving texts. At first, they were all pretty harmless. Calls for attention, begging me to meet them in person. Then, it changed to very sexual texts, until eventually the messages became threatening, and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and their whereabouts, saying he or she would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number, but when I called phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced and that it was likely a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks, not responding to the text, thinking I shouldn't feed the troll, but eventually, it just became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 or 20 texts every morning. I then decided just to change my number altogether. The texting and calls stopped for a while, but sure enough, it started happening again. I called my phone provider, asking if they ever gave out numbers at a user's request, and they said their policy stated that they wouldn't and couldn't unless a valid identification was provided. Then one day, I tried logging onto my Facebook, but was somehow denied. Within a day, friends started contacting me, asking me what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mom who had died years ago. I apologized profusely and told people what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again, at which point I had it deactivated for a while. Enough was enough at this point. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything, but told me that since I or any of my friends and relatives were in no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything at all. At this point, I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker. I decided against it, however, and just hoped it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and continued to ignore any texts and phone calls I received. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received the occasional text as well, which freaked us all out. I hated that they got dragged into it too. One day, I came home and things felt very eerie. Door unlocked, windows open, and no one home. A strong breeze running through the apartment. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls and texts have more or less stopped. I'll get an occasional text, but at most one every 2 weeks. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more weary of the people around me and of my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until this all stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are getting back to normal at this point, and I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say that all dating apps are dangerous and that no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone. FaceTime them first. Skype. Anything. I was naive about it, and I regret it. Be safe, stick close to your friends, and try to sometimes meet people in more traditional ways. Last night, I was watching That 70s Show reruns, eyes heavy and mind in a daze. I was starting to fall asleep when I woke to what I thought was a loud by the patio door. The chocolate chip cookie I was halfway through slid off my hand, somersaulting down my torso as this noise brought me to an awakening twitch. Just an animal, I thought, with the house settling. Eric Foreman is so goofy. Donna is way out of his league. Eric is lucky. I like this show. Back to sleep. This time from the ceiling. I shrieked. What the hell is that? This time, I sit up, with upright posture, like I'm ready to focus on any minute detail that strikes my senses. I turn the kitchen light on, just out of a general state of fear, without really any concern about anything being in the kitchen. I check the back deck from the thump from before. That's super weird, I think. Nothing else happens, so I start to relax some. I'm not really worried at this point, but a little on edge. I'm a college student, spending the summer at home with my parents, working in downtown DC. They're at the beach, so I'm alone in this rather large house. It's 10:36 p.m. when the door knocks. Seriously, I think? No, again, if I were on the set of a horror movie, or had just been watching something scary for that matter, I would have drawn an immediate connection between the thump noise and the door knocking unusually late at night. But neither of these things applied to me at that moment, so I didn't. I was still kind of anxious about those thumps, but when the door knocked, my attention immediately forgot about the noise that was likely nothing to worry about. Probably a salesperson, or a mailman. I remember one time a few years back, a UPS man rang our doorbell at like midnight to drop something off. I was the only one awake at that time, so that had scared the shit out of me back then. Maybe it was something like that, I thought. Most likely scenario would be my buddy Frank, who considered coming over but said he was really too tired. He can be a little spacey though sometimes, so I guess he could have changed his mind without telling me. I guess I'd go over there and at least tell whoever the hell it is that I'd like my privacy. Unless it's Frank, of course, who I will then remind how spacey he can be. A little weirded out by the situation though, I grab the first thing resembling a weapon I can get my hands on. It's an old lacrosse stick. I hold it from the head with the shaft facing outward like a lightsaber. As I turn the corner to my foyer, I see through the door side windows a pair of skinny legs with odd worn slippers. Alright, this is weird. That's definitely a skinny chick. Maybe she's confused? Trying to visit a friend and knocked on the wrong house? The house next door is about the same size and doesn't really look a lot like mine, but I don't know what else it could possibly be at this point. All of this enters my mind in a matter of seconds, between my footsteps in the kitchen and the doormat between the front door and the rest of my home. As I stand between the large, modern door and whoever the hell is out there, I lean my lacrosse stick on the ground behind me so the stranger won't see it. As my hand floats hesitantly towards the doorknob, I hear a voice coming through the other side of the door. No clear words, just light whispers. I assume someone must be with the Slippers girl, because I haven't even opened the door yet, and as far as I can tell, this person hasn't even seen that someone is home. Unless maybe she's talking to herself. That was a thought that didn't come to my mind at all. My hand stopped frozen in air, about halfway between the rest of my body and the door, like I was doing some weird robot dance move. I wait for several seconds, disturbed by the odd synchronization between my movement towards the doorknob and the voice outside. I wait longer. No voices. I take a deep breath through my nose and out through my mouth. I open the door about 3/4 way quickly, like a toddler anxious and curious to discover the monster in their closet. I stick the right half of my body out, facing two dark, feminine figures on my front porch. The first thing I notice is those beat-up slippers. I look up from there, my head and neck tilting slightly upward to see the rest of her. Straight, black hair, uncombed, matted in different directions. She looked sickly, shaking in the cold, with a hooded sweatshirt and tiny khaki shorts. She's about 5'3" and looks 13 years of age, staring straight forward, which, for me, at about 5'9", standing on a raised surface above my lowered porch, is at my pelvis. In the dark, I cannot make out the features on her face, but I could tell something about her was awkward. The way she stood there, off balance, her neck tilted to the left side like a chewed-up, overused doll. Before I can react in any way, I observe her partner, about a half foot behind her and to the left. A noticeably younger girl, maybe 9 years old, but with about an inch on her older sister, wearing a ragged dark blue shirt, black pants, and rain boots. She had similar black hair, though she didn't have the same bizarre demeanor as her older sister. I look down at these two girls, and I have no idea how long it has been since I opened the door. Have they said anything? What do I say? This is fucking weird. Can I help you two? I mutter out in the tone I typically use talking to kids, but with an undertone of chill in my voice. I stutter some when I'm nervous or excited, and here, I could barely make out a word.
Hello, sir, please. We are cold, and would like to use the phone.
The younger one says, her head facing straight forward. Her tone, it was like nothing I had ever heard. It was feminine, sure, but each word left her mouth fully independent of the one before. Like they were just words being spit out of a machine and placed in the correct order by a third party. Almost like a robot. But she was clearly human. A young girl I'm speaking to, yet somehow very, very far off. She didn't sound her age. She sounded at least 14, maybe 15. But she looked no older than 10. Why did she speak to me and not her older sister? What is going on here? Is her older sister shy? Mentally handicapped? Am I dreaming? What does she mean about using my phone? It was like she was speaking off of a script and mixed up her question. I wonder if she meant to ask me something else. Not sure how to respond to this arbitrary question, I manage, well, I'm not sure what you're asking. Are you two lost? First, nothing. Just stares, straight forward, directly ahead, as if with no visual awareness. Then the younger one says,
Please, sir, we are alone and need to call home. Let us in.
Her response, with the same monotone voice, didn't really answer my question. It was like she was speaking without any concern over what I was saying, just when it was time for her next line. And the last part, let us in. Like a command, completely separate from her prior polite and candid requests. Trembling in fear and confused, with a strong sensation telling me something was horribly wrong, I said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't let you into my house. You'll have to just stay here while I grab a phone and call for you. I couldn't leave these two kids just stranded out here, but I knew. Something in the pit of my stomach just told me I couldn't let them in. I was scared shitless. The two just looked straight forward, not responding, and suddenly the older one, who has yet to move or say anything, changes her expression completely. She squeezes her fists as they shake at her sides as if in great pain, and without moving her face or pale neck, makes a smile, showing all of her teeth at once. They were sharp, inhuman, like an animal's. At this, I make an obvious, loud scream of terror. The younger one notices my fear and looks up at me. In her pale face, her eyes. Blackness. Pure black. No clear iris or retina, like two black marbles. Then I noticed her silent, smiling older sister's black eyes as well. A grotesque nausea fills my stomach, closing in on me, choking me. I'm frozen. I can't manage a scream. I just can't. I'm lost in fear. My entire body speeds up, tingling, numbing, and I lose myself. Finally, after what feels like several minutes, I let out a noise of horror that I don't think I've ever made as I close the door in front of me and retreat to the safety of my house. My body is shaking. I stand, crying, trembling in front of my door. I need to reach my cell phone, which is in the family room, and I can hear that 70s show in the background, which brings me some relief, but it sounds off now. Foreign. Almost like another language in my fearful state. I need to call the cops. I know that I can't let them in. Get the fuck out of here! I yell while banging on the door in an attempt to scare them off. Undiscernible sounds come from the other side, like animal cries or barks. It doesn't sound like the younger girl. I know it isn't. I know it's the older girl, the silent, mentally off one. But I just can't fathom this. No. Fuck no. I need to reach my cell phone, but I can't move. I can't lose track of them. I can see the slippers in the side window, and I know that she's still there. More animal noises from outside. I scream, yell, bang my lacrosse stick against the door. Anything I can get out of my tired lungs and muscles. I felt like I was being attacked by a grizzly bear. I was in full-on survival mode, doing all I could to scare them away, but any noise I made was matched by the older girl with her disturbing barks and screams that to this day haunt my dreams. Then from the other side of the door, I hear a muffled,
"We just want to call our mother,"
from the young girl.
"Please, we are scared and alone. Let us in. Let us in."
That last part, "let us in," is the same cadence twice over, like a recording. Please let us in, like a chant.
Let us in. Let us in. Let us in.
The younger girl continues, each demand louder and more assertive than the one before, as the older girl's noises match her demands. I wait for any sign of safety, of this horrible nightmare coming to an end. I continue screaming at them until finally it stops. The noises, the chanting, gone. The slippers are gone. I look out my window, sprinting legs. The other girl running the speed of a male track star, but with her legs twisting over each other like a circus freak. This is so fucked up, I think to myself. I see her trail off, catching up with her younger sister, who must have given the orders to leave while she stayed for a minute or two, barking, screeching, and yelping like a Neanderthal. I watch as the older sister finds her younger sister, waiting on the other side of the road. They stand there, not looking back at my house, just staring straight ahead, the other way, like they were waiting for something. Someone. And suddenly, a large figure walks towards them. Long legs and arms, and lanky, inhuman features. With the shape of a woman, but far too small and awkward in form, like one of those scarecrow animation figures from a Tim Burton film. This creature, this monster, leads them away into the night. I didn't leave my front door the entire night. I couldn't sleep, and barely have since. Close family, my girlfriend, and friends want to believe me. They say they don't think I'm crazy, but I feel they don't actually believe me. This is so fucked up, whatever this is. Wherever they are, it's real. Like they're subhumans trying to take over us. I don't know what this is, but they create this energy of fear and terror like nothing I've ever experienced. I lay awake at night, terrified when I open my eyes. That off older sister might be outside my window, hanging from a tree, smiling at me, waiting for me to walk outside and leave the house. I'm sorry if this post is too long, but I've never shared this with anyone, and this seems like the best place to do so. When I was around 9, I went to summer camp at the nearby YMCA for a few summers. It was a day camp, and there were different camps you could do, such as water sports, crafts, canoeing. Each camp lasted for about 1 week. I started the summer by taking one of the craft camps, a special one that lasted 2 weeks. I was really excited about it, but I was nervous because I didn't know anyone else in my group, and I'm very shy. On the first day, I managed to make friends with an older kid who was in a wheelchair. He was 17, I believe. I'm not sure what his disability was, but he was socially awkward and kind of gave off a creepy vibe. I tried my best to be nice to him because nobody else talked to him, but eventually he started to make me uncomfortable. First, he'd start by talking about how much he hated being in the wheelchair because it made his back hurt. He liked to be able to get out at the end of the day and stretch, as well as do some exercises with his physical therapist. I'd just smile and nod as he talked about this, not knowing what else to say. At some point, I mentioned to him how I was a dancer and really liked acrobatics class. He asked me to show him some of my moves, so I did a cartwheel. He told me that my legs looked beautiful when I stretched them out like that. Being a kid, I didn't think much of the comment, but I started getting uncomfortable when he began telling me how much he liked my hair, or how white my teeth were, or how cute I was because I was so little. One day, he was talking about stretching outside of his wheelchair, and mentioned how good it would feel if someone were to walk on his back. You'd be perfect, just the right size. Would you do that for me one day? I'd love to have you on top of me. He smiled creepily when he said this, so I awkwardly changed the direction of the conversation by telling him how I used to do that for my dad. I was young and stupid, and probably shouldn't have told him that. He got really excited and started talking about how much he loved it, and how good it must have felt for my dad. I bet he loves having his little girl on top of him like that. He reached out to me at this point, and put his hand on my knee. We were sitting by a table in the craft cabin. I awkwardly shoved it off, moving away a little. He smiled and started talking about how good it would feel if I were to do cartwheels on his back and jump on him, maybe even lay down on top of him and rub his sides. I got really uncomfortable at this point, and luckily, my mom drove up a moment later, so I was ready to leave. This was on the weekend, and the camp was going to continue to the following Monday. I didn't mention anything to my mom, because I figured he was just lonely and awkward, and didn't mean to be creepy. But when I got to the camp Monday, he immediately came up to me. I was so upset that I couldn't see you this weekend. I missed my little girl. I smiled and awkwardly walked away, but he followed me. We were all going as a group to the craft cabin, and he came up next to me and asked if I wanted to sit in his lap and ride to the cabin with him. I politely declined and managed to avoid him for the rest of the day, until I was walking to my mom's car at the end of the day. He came up to me, grabbed my hand, and pulled me towards him. "You really hurt me today. How would you like it if I hurt you?" I yanked my hand away and walked quickly to the car. I told my mom all about it as soon as I got in the car. She immediately drove over to the camp office and spoke with the camp leader about it, who I shared my story with. He assured us that he would take care of it immediately. As we were driving away after the meeting, I saw 2 counselors go up to the boy and lead him into the camp office. The look on his face looked like he was going to murder someone. I never saw him again after that. I was told that he was kicked out of the camp and never allowed to return, and for the rest of the week the camp counselors would check on me and make sure I was okay. So, creepy boy from summer camp, I hope you got your issues worked out, and that you're finally living a happy life now.
When I was around 5, my mom, older brother, and I moved into a house of our own. Up until then, we were living with my sister, her husband, and my 2 nephews until my mom got back up on her feet. Even before moving into this new house, I was somewhat of a troubled child, for lack of a better word. I would wake up screaming most of every morning from horrible nightmares. I used to say I would see 2 little girls in the upstairs bedroom. There were no little girls in the house. It wasn't until years later after we moved that my sister had moved and found out that 2 little girls had passed away in the house a few years before moving in, but I'm getting off track here. We moved across town into some fairly decent duplex homes, would-be spacious 3-bedroom house. We were all excited to finally have our own home, and finally have our own room, no more sleeping on the couch. Our excitement fairly quickly diminished when we started experiencing things that we couldn't explain. My mom was fairly religious in the sense that we didn't attend church, but we would pray every night before bed and before each meal, and sometimes read Bible stories. That being said, about the month after moving in, my cousin who worked for the local church had gifted us some blessed palm crosses. My mother took them and hung one above the back door, which was connected to the kitchen, and one near our living room door, which was adjacent to the kitchen, residing by the stairs that led upstairs. A few days after hanging them, we started noticing every morning when we'd come down for breakfast, one would be on the floor. So after a few days, my mother decided to hang them from 2 nails and attach a piece of tape to the back in hopes that they would stop falling off, thinking that a breeze or something of such knocked them down. I have a hard time remembering in depth all the experiences we encountered, but I do remember hearing someone inside the wall talking to me. My mother was the first to really notice this because I would stop playing with my toys in the living room a few feet from the front of her and look up and say, "It's back," then continue playing. Over the next few months, more and more weird things started happening. Toys in my room would go off randomly. Toys that you would have to wind up or use a remote control to move. I had picture books with buttons that would talk attached to the book, and they would be in our hallway closet. At the most random times, they would go off like someone was pressing them. It was at this point that we were experiencing 3 occurrences, and my mom started to believe that there may be something paranormal going on. She went out and got some sage and attempted to clean the house while my brother and I were at school and he was at work. She recounts that she saged the entire house. Living room, kitchen hallways, bathroom, my brother's room, and her room. But as she was entering my room, she got an off-putting feeling. She nevertheless walked in and started to sage my room. As she's walking around my room, she hears someone whisper her name. Deborah. She describes it as a low whisper. She, of course, was on edge, but tried to logically explain it away and finish the saging. Not even 5 minutes after she heard the whisper, she heard another whisper. This time, it was more pronounced. Deborah. She says she froze, and as she did, her ponytail lifted up and dropped back down, slouching on her back. She then slowly walked out of my room, went down the stairs, got the car keys, ran out the front door, and drove to my school. She stayed there for 4 hours until the end of the school day. We went to my aunt's and didn't return home until we picked up my brother from work later that night. It seemed like after her attempt to clean the house with sage, the activity really started to pick up. My brother would often hear someone whispering their name, Deborah, Joseph, or would sometimes hear what sounded like someone or something telling them to say profanities. My mom didn't know where to go, who to see, or what to do. The people she told what was going on thought she was crazy, and the other house just didn't want to hear it. So all we could do was continue to pray and keep a positive attitude. Whatever was in that house seemed to target myself and my mother more than my brother. We don't know why. Eventually, I stopped sleeping in my room and started sleeping with my mom. I used to say there was a man that lived in my closet. I would take my family up to my closet and show them where the man was, of course, and they never saw anything, but I did. It was about a year of living there when my mother and I started seeing things. She would wake up one night and see the silhouette of a man on the ceiling over the bed, but she wouldn't be able to move or make a sound. Then she'd drift back into sleep like nothing happened. A few nights later I would wait, the same experience. We would often see what appeared to be red glowing eyes looking through windows. I would even feel at night like someone had carried me out of the bed and had somehow got me outside. I couldn't wake up, but I could feel the cold wind and hear it and various other sounds from outside. We would often see what appeared to be shadows peeking around corners and ducking back when we'd look in their direction. But there was one encounter by far that shocked us both to the core. One night we're in bed and my brother was working graveyard. I was passed out and my mom, being a mom, couldn't sleep until she knew my brother was home safe. She sat at the foot of the bed, which was about 2 feet away from her small stand that held our old thick Dell computer. She was playing one of the old programmed games when she says she thought she heard something down the hall. She crowned her neck to the side to peek down the hall and didn't see anything. Not thinking anything of it, she continued to play the game. That's when she heard the sound again. This time it was louder. She says when she crowned her neck around the corner this time, she saw some kind of bony, flesh-colored creature walking from around the corner, as if coming from either the bathroom, my brother's room, or the stairs that were in the middle of the hallway and entering my bedroom. The best way she could describe it was, it sort of resembled the alien from the movie Aliens, the long pointed head but smaller, fleshier-like. She says she let out a gasp and the creature just froze in place. It stopped like it heard the gasp and slowly turned its head and stared at her with no distinct facial features whatsoever that she could see. She sat there frozen in fear, knowing that it was aware of her presence. She started to pray, at which point it turned and slowly walked into my bedroom. Again, she didn't know what to do in the situation. Does she wake me up and walk us down the hallway, crossing past my bedroom door to get to the stairs to leave the house? Does she call the cops? Do we climb out the bedroom window and jump from the second story to the ground? What does she do? She sat there for a good 5 minutes and somehow got the courage to go see what the creature was and what it was doing. Ready for a battle, she stood up, walked down the hallway, flicked on the hallway light, walked into my bedroom, flicked on the light, and to her astonishment, there was nothing there. She checked everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, made sure the window was locked, but there was nothing there. She then returned to the bedroom and sat there all night waiting for my brother to come home. The next day was fine. There was no kind of experiences whatsoever. Not to say that these occurrences happened on a daily basis. When it came time for bed, she put me in and said she had to go see my brother. I lay there on my side, facing away from the door. What I didn't know is that she was going to tell him about what had happened the night before. A few minutes passed and I feel her sit on the bed next to me, so I roll over to say goodnight and all the good stuff, but when I rolled over, it wasn't her sitting there. What I saw, and I swear to God may he strike me dead right now if I'm lying. What I saw was a darkish colored creature with flesh clinging to it, with its long head looming over me. I screamed. I didn't know what else to do. I screamed so loud that I'm certain I woke the neighbors on the other side of us. As I sat up to push myself off the bed to run out the room, the creature, in one quick motion, darted either under the bed or into the corner somewhere as I ran out the room down the hall. I see my mom and brother, pale as a ghost, shaking on the verge of passing out, trying to explain what I just saw and that we need to leave. Mind you, up until this point, what my mother and I experienced, we never shared. I was 5 or 6 at the time. I didn't know what she had seen and vice versa, but it was that experience that was the last straw in a sense. We ended up sleeping on the couch that night. The next morning, I drew them to the best of my ability what I saw, and it confirmed what my mother had seen the previous night. We didn't live there for too much longer, but until that day, we experienced unexplainable phenomenons. On the day we were moving, both crosses that I mentioned earlier were thrown off the wall into the middle of the 2 rooms at the bottom of the stairs without there being any wind or draft or anything that could expel it away. When moving out, I had to go through all my books and decide which ones I wanted to keep and which ones I was going to give away when suddenly we stumble upon an old book that was way too advanced for my reading level as a 6-year-old, and it didn't belong to my mom or brother either. The book was about trolls. It was when I saw this book and saw the creepy drawing of the sinister troll on the cover that I was able to tell my mom that was him. That was the man that sat in my closet. This was roughly 16 to 17 years ago now, and I often wonder if the people who lived in the house after us ever experienced anything in that home. Of course, there were a lot more other things that we experienced at that home that weren't as prominent or terrifying as the ones mentioned above. I know this was long, but if you want any more clarity or anything like that, just let me know. I'll be happy to do my best to elaborate further. It feels good to find a place where I can share this encounter and not get judged or looked at as a loony or a liar.
My name is Stan. I'm 17 years old, and this story happened about 4 years ago. The school I went to was in a very rural area in my village. My friend Peter went to the same school, but I lived further away. His mom would always drop him off near my house, and we would always walk to school together. On our way to school, we would always pass some farms, and one of them had this really old, creepy house that was abandoned for years. One day, me and Peter said we should check it out and see what's in there, basically. We couldn't go after school because, like I said, Peter lived further away, and his mom needed to get him home. This was also during the winter, so it got dark sooner. So myself and Peter, we came up with the plan that Peter would have a sleepover around my house. And when my parents were asleep, we would sneak out and explore the abandoned farmhouse. It was Friday, and the past few days had been snowing. After school, Peter came to my house. We spent the evening playing video games and looking up creepy videos on the internet, anxiously waiting to sneak out. 1 a.m. rolled around, and we put our coats on and snuck out my bedroom window, which is ground level. We had one flashlight between the both of us, which Peter managed to sneak out of his dad's garage. We walked through the farm fields and made it to the house. Naturally, the first thing we did was try to open the front door, but it was locked. We looked around at a few of the windows, and one of them was smashed open. So we used this as our entrance. Surprisingly, the place seemed rather untouched for how long it had been rumored to be abandoned. It was just covered in dust and had a really strong smell. Not bad necessarily, but it did smell odd. I shone my flashlight to the top of the stairs. I couldn't see anything, but it seemed really eerie up there. And then I heard wood creaking. It kind of sounded like slow footsteps, but I wasn't certain. Peter then said, "We should check upstairs." I told him I'm not going up there. There's probably some maniac up there waiting to kill us. The next thing that happened was the phone rang. One of those really old phones made myself and Peter jump out of our skin. At that time, I didn't think about it, but I thought it was weird of how someone was calling this house and it was abandoned. I picked it up and I said in a nervous voice, hello? For a second there wasn't any response. And then a man spoke on the other end saying, "I'm not a maniac. Why don't you come upstairs and see for yourself?" At that point, loud, heavy footsteps ran across the upstairs room and toward the top of the stairs. Peter and I ran out the farmhouse as fast as we could. We ran out down to the farm. I glanced back to see if there was someone chasing us, but there wasn't. So I told Peter to slow down so we could catch our breath for a second. After taking a better look at the house, one of the upstairs lights was on, and there was a dark figure standing at the window, watching us. I didn't know what to think, and honestly, I was terrified. The light then turned out, and the both of us made our way back to my house. We managed to sneak back inside without making my parents wake up. Peter didn't say much. I think he was too creeped out as to what just happened. And to be honest, I didn't feel like talking either. I was actually quite paranoid that, I don't know, that guy was going to follow us to my house. Thankfully, at least to what I know of, we weren't followed. From that night on, every time me and Peter walk to school, we look at that creepy farmhouse. We can't help but feel someone's looking back at us. When I was a little girl, maybe around 11 years old, a cult tried to recruit me and my friends through the dark web. This was in 2012. We lived in a gated community, but somehow this church named Assembly of Prayer Christian Church would have its members walking around trying to get everyone to attend their church. My friends and I would go to the local pool for our neighborhood, and these people were taking pictures of everyone, including parents, lifeguards, and us. We looked up their Facebook, but none of the pictures would be there. It only showed the outside of their building. Then a rumor started to circulate that these pictures were on the deep web. I didn't believe it until all of my friends and I went over our friend Greg's house. Greg went on a regular browser, but somehow got on the deep web. I didn't know much about it, so I just watched. We looked up Assembly of Prayer Christian Church, and some Facebook popped up again. We went to it, but we can see more photos than we could before. It was like we had more access than before, but still didn't see much, just inside their chapel. That's when Greg mentioned that the rest of the photos might be on the dark web. I only knew about the deep web, but they sounded like the same thing. That's when he went on a browser. It wasn't Tor, it was some other browser that I can't remember the name of. He made a call and asked someone on the phone where and how to search what he was looking for. We interrupted him, telling him that he needs to just put the church name in again. He said it's not that easy. When he got off the phone, he searched Free the Dolphins from Yellow Cowboy. Then the Facebook page popped up, but we had complete access, not as an admin, but as if we were a friend or we were following the page. Then we saw the pictures. But what was creepy is that every single picture had a name of the person, or multiple names if it were more than one person. We then saw our pictures. There were a picture with about 8 of us in it walking to the pool with a link under it. Greg clicked on it. We entered a live video. We were looking at the inside of the chapel with a man standing on a podium. He said, "Welcome, number 77. In the top right-hand corner of our screen was 77. We were number 77. Greg typed hi. Then the man on the stage said that he was called Chief, so just type Chief if we need him. Greg typed okay. Chief then said that he would continue. He picked up a picture. It was one of my friends. He held it in front of the camera, then everyone in the chat put numbers. I saw a lot of numbers between 1 and 5. A few were higher than 5. Greg looked at us confused. Then Chief looked at the camera and said, "Number 77, we're waiting for you." I believe he typed 3. I can't really remember. For the next hour or so, this man that was called Chief had put all of our pictures in front of the camera, and we were rated between 1 and 10. By coincidence, I had the highest rating. Out of nowhere, the stream ended, and we were back on the Facebook page with all of our pictures. But all of our pictures disappeared. Being that this is all we got on for, we got off, and all of us went home. The next couple of days seemed weird. The church people disappeared. No one was asking us to join anymore. One day, everything became even more strange. One of my friends were over my house while my parents were at work. We were on Facebook watching YouTube. We both paused and looked at each other. I looked outside the window and one of the people from the church was just standing there. I looked back at my friend and she pointed at the front door. I looked out the peephole and another guy was standing there. We looked out the back window and there were literally 20 people standing in a formation. So I called the police like any other person would. And of course, these people were long gone by the time the police arrived. The police said that they will keep a report on file. They tried looking at the security cameras throughout the neighborhood, but nothing was showing these people, and there were time gaps within the footage. It's been a while since this incident, but I will never forget what happened when I went on the dark web.
This particular encounter still freaks me out. I know how horrible it could have ended, and I sometimes thank my crippling social anxiety, as well as general common sense, for preventing the worst. My freshman year of high school, when I was about 14, proved challenging socially. Afraid to really connect with strangers, I would typically eat lunch by myself or sit in the back of a classroom to avoid detection. I did have a few close friends from band, and I also grew fond of an equally awkward girl in my public speaking class. Now, because our public speaking teacher was also the drama teacher and cared much more about the musical than assigning us speeches, we never had to stand up in front of the class. Instead, I would walk into the room, sit down next to my friend, and talk to her for about an hour until the bell rang. After probably about 3 months, this class became a nightmare. I was walking through the halls one day in between classes when I was approached by a fellow freshman that I knew from band. She handed me a piece of paper and winked at me. "This is from Zach," she said. I believe that I stared at her rather blankly, earning me an eye roll. "The Zach that sits behind you in public speaking," she clarified. Still confused, but not wanting to appear stupid, I smiled, nodded, and thanked her. I put the note in my backpack and resolved to read it when I returned home that evening. Once in the comfort of my bedroom, I retrieved the note after recalling a very tall and large senior named Zach who did, in fact, sit behind me in that class. I didn't remember ever speaking to him, but thinking it might have been a message from the teacher, I opened the lined paper up. As I skimmed the words, I immediately became uncomfortable. Printed in sloppy handwriting was a cheesy love poem. In it, he described all of my physical features, mentioned my full name, which he spelled correctly, a feat which not many people can accomplish, and professed his undying love. Now, I was very, very confused. I had never even spoken to this kid. I only ever talked to the other freshmen in the class, and I had no account on any social media platform where he could have lifted the information. Even if I did know him, my mental issues would have definitely prevented any sort of long-term relationship. At this point, I was honestly a little more scared at the prospect of having to speak with someone I didn't know than the actual poem, but I still began to skip that particular class. After not attending public speaking for a good 2 weeks, I was eventually approached by a girl I knew from band, a fellow clarinet player by the name of Corey. "I heard you've been ditching," she said with a bit of a smirk. "Good girls don't ditch." When I just laughed and shrugged, she continued, "Well, your boyfriend thinks you're avoiding him." "What? That Zach guy? He's definitely not my boyfriend." "I have some classes with him too. I think he's a nice guy. You should give him a chance. He likes you a lot." Wanting to end the conversation, I just said that I would think about it and walked away. I think that Corey told Zach what I had said, and things started to escalate. I received a similar poem taped to my locker a few days later, and I began to see Zach standing outside of my classes as I left. Because he was blocking the door, I had no choice but to talk to him. I don't remember the exact conversation, but I remember that he pulled out a large black binder and handed it to me. He told me that he was a writer, and that all the pages were filled with poems for me. After flipping through some very cringe-worthy writing, I believe that I thanked him, not wanting to hurt any feelings. He interpreted this as a go-ahead for a kiss, and I became pinned to a wall. This guy was well over 200 pounds, so he had quite the advantage physically against a small 14-year-old girl. When he finally came up for air, smiling like he had just won the ultimate prize, I told him that I was running late for my next class and he released me. I felt assaulted and even more freaked out, but I never told anyone about this. I never told anyone even when he began to wait for me by my brother's car. He went to the same school and drove me home. I never told anyone even when I saw Zach walking through my neighborhood, staring at houses intently like he was trying to figure out which one was mine. I had to change all of the routes I took to get to my classes, and I would sneak out back doors just to avoid him. I guess I figured that the school year was almost over, and once he graduated, my problems would resolve themselves. However, about a month later, I was leaving the school with a couple of band friends. It was around midnight after a musical performance. I was in the pit orchestra, and we were going to grab a bite to eat at a village inn. As I made my way to my friend's car, I felt hands grasp me around my waist. Spinning around in fright, I noticed Zach had pinned me against a different car. "I haven't seen you in a while," he said. "But that's okay. Love transcends time." I think I just smiled uncomfortably and said something about being busy with the musical. He ran a hand up my back and wrapped it around the back of my neck. "I know you're super busy, and that got me thinking. I love you more than anything, and I know that we're young, and I know that I don't have a ring, but please run away with me. Please marry me." Completely stunned and paralyzed, one of my friends arrived. She overheard the conversation and picked up on how freaked out I was, and she swooped in. "Hey," she said. "We have to leave right now. Sorry. My mom wants me home in like 5 minutes, and she'll not be happy if I'm late. Come on." She grabbed my arm and wiggled my body free from Zach. "Wait, so will you?" Zach asked as my friend dragged me away. I said something stupid about having to think about it, and I made my way into my friend's car without any other problems. We laughed and joked about it later, but it scared me enough to take my cautiousness to the next level. For the rest of the school year, I made complex plans on how to travel between classes so I wouldn't have to see him, and I made sure that I walked to and from any car with a group of people. Again, I never told anyone, even though an 18-year-old adult man proposing to and stalking a young girl was more than not okay. I wish I had, though, and I wish it had ended there. A few years ago, when I was about 21, I was scrolling through my Facebook page when, all of a sudden, messages from people I hadn't talked to in years began flooding in. They all said something along the lines of, "Holy shit, this is creepy. Oh my god, are you okay?" And they included links to a news article. Apparently, Zach had been arrested for the possession of child pornography and for multiple counts of molestation against a minor. A couple of the girls mentioned in the article I even knew from high school. I was pretty decent friends with them too, even though they were freshmen when I was a senior. I just hoped that he didn't hurt them because they were friends with me. He's in jail now for a very long time. However, if you search my name through Google, you'll still find books that Zach actually published containing hundreds of poems that he dedicated to me. But honestly, I'm just glad that he's locked up and unable to hurt any more girls. Let me preface this by saying that this story happened when I was a lot younger and less worldly wise about the creeps of the world. Had I known what I know now, this story would have ended before it even began. This story begins when I, a 16-year-old girl, got bored one day and decided to download a version of the Tinder app. After a couple of swipes, a guy's face popped up, and what intrigued me was that he didn't have his name in his profile. Think MS Park instead of Mark. Now, he didn't seem like a rapper, so I swiped right out of curiosity. We matched straight away and began talking. Just your average run-of-the-mill conversation. What do you do for fun? Been to any parties recently? That kind of thing. After a bit of digging, it emerged that he went to the school at the bottom of my road, so we arranged to meet that weekend. At this point, I didn't even know his name, but felt too awkward to ask it after we'd been talking for all this time. Saturday came, and Mark turns up about 20 minutes late. He's carrying a rose, presumably to make up for the fact that he's only around 5'2", which had been cleverly omitted in the photos he'd posted. I'm not usually into short guys, but I humored him, and we went and sat in a park in the town center to talk. We talked for about 2 hours about everything and nothing at all, until Mark asked me if he could be so bold as to kiss me. I was flattered, but declined. He persisted, saying that it was very important, until I lost my temper finally and asked him why. He explained to me that he suffered from sex-based migraines, and if he was deprived of sexual contact for too long, he would get an excruciating headache that would render him immobile for 48 hours. Although I was naive, I wasn't stupid enough to believe this nonsense, but wanted to get home quickly after this meeting had turned sour. I leant over, gave him a quick peck on the cheek, and hurried away into the piercing parlor across the road, where the owners knew me and talked with me for an hour until I felt secure enough to get the bus home. I thought that this would be the end of the encounter, and traveled home calmly. Me and my mother have never had a strong relationship, and I didn't want to really talk to her about it, so when she asked about my day, I just brushed it off and said I had met a friend for lunch. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room and pulled out my phone. My stomach dropped. There was a Snapchat notification from MS Sparks. My username must have been on the profile I set up on Tinder. How stupid of me, I think back now, for I could have avoided a good many unsolicited dick pics otherwise. I gingerly opened it. It was a 10-second video of him lying on his bed at home, looking dazed and confused. The caption, "Look what you do to me." I realized that he was actually faking a migraine and filming it to send to me. I blocked the account and sat watching TV for a while. No harm done, I thought. Wrong again. From knowing where I went to school and the fact that I have an unusually spelled first name, a friend request came in from Mark a couple of days later. I declined, but he just sent it again. I was a little weirded out, but he seemed to have mutual friends with me, and from his profile, I could learn more about him, i.e., how to avoid him. The messages started pouring in, starting with, "I really enjoyed today. Hope we can see each other again soon," and ending with such gems as, "I need you, insert my name here." I laughed and just blocked him again. One day, as I was catching my bus to school, a familiar face smiled at me from the bus stop. It was Mark again, this time with his friends. I wasn't suspicious, as my bus stop was opposite his school, and I vaguely knew one of his friends, so I smiled, talked, and made pleasantries until my bus came. This was to be the first of many encounters with Mark, all of which I brushed off as a coincidence, since he lived and went to school in the same part of town I did. The last encounter I had with Mark was on my way to meet a friend. The week before, I had severely twisted my knee playing netball and was struggling to walk from my bus stop to where my friend with a car had arranged to meet me. As I turned around the corner, who should appear but Mark, smiling widely and greeting me with a wave. He asked what had happened to my leg. I told him it had been a netball injury. He asked where I was going. I told him I was meeting my friend. He asked what time I was going to meet her, and at this point I just said in about an hour. He said his house was right around the corner, and putting his hand firmly on my lower back, he offered that I could wait there with a cup of tea until my friend came. I tried to protest, saying I would be fine waiting in a cafe, but Mark insisted and half-guided, half-pushed me to his house. When we got in, I asked if I could use the bathroom, to which he said yes and showed me to. I texted my friend after locking myself in there, and said that a guy I vaguely knew had let me wait in his house and she could come pick me up from there. I didn't tell her the whole story, as I didn't want to worry her and or have her phone my mother, with whom I would have met a worse fate than with Mark. Mark then knocks on the door, asking if I was okay. I said yes, but that I'd be a couple of minutes, and he agreed to wait downstairs for me. When I let myself out of the bathroom, I walked downstairs to find Mark lying motionless on the floor of the living room/kitchen. I panicked, thinking something had happened to him, and went to check his pulse. As I reached down, his hand shot out to feel my breast through my shirt, and he weakly croaked out, "Need release." I batted his hand away, and tried to stand up to get him a glass of water. "Need you," insert my name. "Feel me." His trousers, which I hadn't looked at until now, were unbuttoned and he was stroking himself, eyes now open and locked on me. I freaked out. I ran up the stairs and struggled with the lock on the door, hearing his slow footsteps getting closer. Just as I was opening the door, his voice called out from the other end of the corridor. "Could you at least clean my oven then?" I whisked the door open and slammed it behind me, almost in tears at both the pain in my knee and the sheer weirdness of the situation. After limping a couple roads down from his house, I rang my friend and said there was nothing to worry about, but could she please hurry. She was right around the corner at this point, and we drove off with me telling her everything in between shaky breaths. The weirdest thing about this whole story? A couple of days later I ran into Mark again. He acted as if nothing had happened that day, offered me some gum, and then caught a bus from my bus stop. It was almost as if he didn't even remember anything from that day, and I sure as hell wish I didn't. I haven't seen him around in some time, but that could just be because he's gone off to university.
My mom had always been iffy about me going to sleepover since I was a kid. I'm 20 now, in university, but being a broke college student, still living with my parents, who have never neglected to treat me like their little baby. Truth be told, I'm extremely thankful to be so loved by my parents, as I infinitely love them back, but at times, it can become suffocating. I met Myra last semester in junior English, and we hit it off immediately. She was one of those people you instantly connect with, and become very good friends with, very fast. She wasn't native to my city, and said she was originally from Chicago. She was beautiful, and I thought she was much prettier than I was. But she disagreed. I would sometimes even catch her looking at me with this intensely focused admiration. It really did wonders to my confidence. She was sweet, very intelligent, and seemed normal enough, and we shared similar tastes and hobbies. I was majoring in kinesiology, and she in physiology. We both loved parties, dolphins, and Malaysian food. But perhaps the oddest similarity we shared was a strong and rather secretive penchant for Barbie dolls. My love for Barbie dolls and their pretty faces had just stuck with me since I was a child, perhaps because I still feel like a kid sometimes. For Myra, she said it was more about the design, the perfect intricacies of the clothes, the hair, and the body parts, as she described it. It wasn't long before we made plans to hang out outside of school, and she invited me to a sleepover on the following Saturday and encouraged me to bring all my dolls. I can't wait to meet them. I asked my mom if I could go the next day. "You barely know this girl." "You'd like her, Mom. I invited her to come over next week." I was convinced that Myra would become a long-term friend, one that would eventually form a bond with my parents as well. Hesitantly, my mom agreed to let me go, but insisted that I come home immediately on Sunday morning. I nodded. Saturday couldn't have come sooner. I packed my 4 favorite dolls in a duffel bag and my sleepover gear in another. Myra came and picked me up in a blue Sentra. As soon as I got in, she smiled warmly and offered me a shot of Grey Goose. It was vodka, on a Saturday night. I couldn't say no. I ended up taking 4 shots on an empty stomach, and being the lightweight that I am, quickly reached the intimidating boundary between impeded consciousness and completely blacking out. We got to her place, though I couldn't exactly pinpoint where we had driven to. I could make out that she lived in a rented, ramshackle house on the outskirts of the city. "It was cheap and I'm broke," she laughed. My vision continued to spin and wobble incessantly. She helped me up the splintery front porch and we stepped inside. It was meticulously kept. Books, photos, furniture perfectly organized. Wow, Myra, OCD much? We both giggled. We made our way into what I think was the living room and sat down on the musty, cherry brown rug. She brought me some bread and a glass of water to sober up. Okay, are we seriously gonna play with Barbies now? I'm pretty fucked up. I could tell I was slurring. Well, maybe you shouldn't have drank so much, you idiot. Here, let's watch TV for now. Hopefully you'll sober up soon. Myra was strangely calm. If I invited a friend over for the night and she was too drunk to function before the night had even begun, I'd be pretty agitated, or at the least a bit disappointed. She put on an episode of Friends. I barely stumbled onto the lime green couch on the side of the room. I remember hearing the clap, 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 clap in the theme song, and only staying awake for a couple more minutes after that. I slowly drifted off into darkness. The next day, I awoke to see that I was no longer on the couch anymore. I was laying on bare, hardwood floor with a thin pillow under my head and a wool blanket sprawled across me. I was so hungry and still exhausted. I looked up to face a single, dim light bulb at the center of the flaky, gray ceiling and a set of stairs on the other side of the tiny, dark room. I was in a basement, my bag of clothes beside me, but the bag of Barbies was missing. My phone was beside the bag in a pool of sticky red liquid, dead. I hadn't bothered to bring my charger as I was only staying the night and don't care too much for excessively using my phone. My stiff body ached tremendously. I focused and took in my surroundings for about 5 seconds before I became blinded by a deafening headache. It didn't stop after that. Worst hangover ever. I held my head and felt cloth wrapped around it. Myra? I struggled to call out, my voice dry and raspy. No response. The sides of my head continued to pound with agony. What the fuck happened last night? I slowly crawled to the shiny metal boiler in the corner of the room to catch a quick glimpse of what I looked like. My tired eyes sunk into dark circles. My skin was filthy, caked with a sticky gray layer of dirt. The ragged cloth covering most of my head was dark blue, coated with blotches of dried blood. Had I fallen somewhere? Myra! I called out again, even louder. The thumping inside my head grew stronger. I stumbled up the wooden stairs. All of her books and possessions were gone. The lime green couch and a couple of chairs remained. It was like she had moved out overnight. She, and every trace of her, was gone. My money was still in my wallet, so she hadn't conned me for monetary gain as I had first assumed. I gathered my belongings and hurried out of the house. My eyes narrowed. The surge of bright golden sunlight hit me like a truck, and I fell to my knees. My headache was unbearable. I don't know how long I was withering in pain before I finally regained the will to stand back up. I walked over to the narrow dirt road that passed beside the small house. Luck was on my side, and I noticed a rusted, silver Ford pickup truck hurling dirt behind it, driving towards me shortly after. I waved frantically, and the truck rolled to a stop. It was an elderly couple. "Hello there. Are you okay?" The man called out in a concerned tone. "To be honest, sir, I have no idea where I am and would just like to get home." "Well, we're a long way from the city. Perhaps you'd like to get to a hospital first, sweetheart?" The lady looked worriedly at my head. All I could think of was my mom. I had never gone to a doctor's appointment, let alone the hospital, without her, and wasn't planning to today. "Thank you, but I'm fine. My mother is expecting me." "All right, honey. Get in," the man said hesitantly. I threw my bag inside and we drove away from the mysterious little house. "Where to?" "Sheridan, Pittsburgh, please." I continued to hold my head. I had no idea what to think. Who the fuck was Myra? Why had she just left me? A medley of sadness, pain, and utter confusion consumed me. It felt like I had been gone forever, completely disassociated from the present. The subtle heat of the fall afternoon became magnified through the windows of the old truck. It was probably long past the morning I told my mom I'd be home during. Would you mind telling me the time? It is 2:44 p.m., October the 15th, the old lady said cheerily. The pain in my head stopped, paralyzed by the immense fear that suddenly engulfed me. It was October the 15th? The plans for our sleepover were for the 28th of September. I had been unconscious and inside that house for almost 2 weeks? God knows what happened in that time. Nervously, I uttered a soft moan. What's wrong? The lady looked back at me. I didn't want to go into detail. It's just this headache. It hurts so much. I broke into loud sobs. Let me take a look at your head, love. I was a nurse for 30 years. Jim, turn to the hospital. We're getting this young lady some help right away. No, really, it's fine. I just want to go to my mom. Trust me, sweetheart. Your parents will thank us. With nothing to lose, I consented. Jim pulled over briefly to let his wife climb into the back with me and continued to drive. Okay, let's see here. She raised her trembling, ancient hands to my head and started to unwrap the cloth. I shrieked in anguish. I could feel raw skin ripping off the top of my head. A wound? The lady only unwrapped the cloth off about a quarter of my head before she gasped and swiftly recoiled with sheer horror painted across her face, her eyes wide. What's wrong? I whimpered anxiously. The lady covered her wrinkled mouth with her hand and pointed at the side of my head. I pulled myself up to look in the rearview mirror. My exposed head was patterned with streaks of red and pink. A swarm of little ivory maggots feasted on the glistening, raw flesh that burned excruciatingly upon touch. My hair completely gone. I had been scalped. I almost fell unconscious from terror until I noticed a red gash deeper down the side of my head. I struggled to pull the cloth back more, and then I saw it. At that point, the shock of the discovery outweighed my threshold for pain. I had to see the rest to confirm my suspicion. I ripped the rest of the cloth off my head to face reality in full. Hot drips of crimson blood ran down my face, into my mouth, all over my clothes and onto the seat. The lady screamed loud enough that it caused Jim to swerve suddenly and pull over. He, too, looked back and let out a frightful cry. Myra, that bitch. She'd taken all my hair and both of my ears. The subtle rustling of the maggots continued.
This is my first post here. This experience still gives me chills to this day. I actually have a few other camp encounters that I can share if anyone's interested, mainly occurring along the Appalachian Trail with campers. North Georgia is a mighty interesting place. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in North Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities and a few summer camps. I'd say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. There were no religious requirements, nor religion-specific focus. Rather, it was a place for kids who were often in the minority to come to a camp that allowed them to meet some other kids like them. Staff came from all over. We had many Australians, lots of Brits, a few Israelis, and people from various areas of the USA. Each night around 10, most of the staff was able to go out on the town for a couple of hours. Enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins. We rotated. This particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a hot day and was a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. For some backstory on the town, generally, we were extremely well received by the community, despite some differences. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer. We bought supplies at the local Walmart, and often took the campers on tubing trips or occasionally out to dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we'd been out to the bars in the area many times already that session. The 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would after work. About 30 minutes in, a white man in his 20s came up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but didn't think much of it at the time. He introduced himself, then told us that he was having a party that night at his place. "Anyone can come," he said. Black, white, gay, straight. I found it odd that he'd open his speech with that disclaimer. Of course the party should be open to everyone. Why did he feel the need to specify? But we'd all had a few beers at that point, and were feeling pretty loose. He talked for a bit longer, and nothing really seemed off. We told him we were working at a camp in the area, and couldn't stay out, so we'd probably be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get into the car. As we approached it, we saw the same guy come out of the shadows. He had a buddy with him, with a shaved head. His expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed. He pounded his fist into his hand, then took off his shirt and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in my group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out of his back pocket. At summer camp, most of us staff carried knives. We spent a lot of time building campfires and the like, and asked what they wanted. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us he was going to beat us down. Kevin started walking toward the two guys, but we pulled him back. He told us his buddies were on the way. Sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot. It's all kind of blurry from there. I remember jumping into one of the cars, pulling Kevin with us. It felt like we were surrounded, though there were probably only 7 or 8 of them. Rocks were thrown at the car, and we sped off. My heart was beating like crazy. We never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we told the story to the competing bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots, cheersed us, and said we'd always be welcome in his bar in that town. Had no more problems in the town itself, but when I took some campers up on a 2-day hike up the Appalachian Trail, that was another story.
I was 4 years old when this story took place. We lived in a very mundane apartment complex that only had 3 floors, but that didn't bother me, as I stayed home most of the time. One afternoon, I was home alone with my maid, who was cooking lunch for me. After lunch, she told me that she had to go work at someone's house that evening, and that she didn't know when she'd be back. I remember feeling extremely sad, and that must have been evident on my face because she responded to my looks by saying, "You can come with me if you like, it's just a few doors down, so it's not much of a walk." My eyes lit up when she said this. The following evening, we arrived at the house. I could hear the television from where I was. My maid knocked on the door, but no one answered. When she knocked again, a young woman opened the door. She was sort of a partner for my maid who would work with her majority of the time. We stepped inside, and immediately my eyes alighted to a very porky-looking woman with disheveled hair lying down on the couch holding a television remote. To my left, 2 young boys sat in front of each other, busying themselves with toy blocks. My maid asked me to play with them, so I obliged. I sat down beside them as my maid and her friend strode out of the living room and into the kitchen. This is where the story starts to take a turn. 10 minutes after I sat down, I heard the woman suddenly gasp for air whilst clutching her chest. My heart sank and the blocks dropped from my hand. My maid and her friend rushed in and saw the woman's face turning blue. She kept croaking the words, "Big man, big man." Just then, a dark shadow materialized beside her. He was so tall that he stretched up to the ceiling. I was so scared I couldn't even think straight. The 2 boys next to me looked just as shocked as I was. Then, the woman fell silent and her eyes clamped shut. It was silent for almost a full minute before her eyes shot open again, and I swear, I thought her pupils had turned just a shade darker. I wish I wasn't there for what happened next. The woman began laughing like a maniac. Her wide eyes darted in their sockets from one end of the room to the next. She kept puffing up her chest and writhing around like a terrified worm. My maid stumbled back, hit the edge of the couch, and fell to the floor, throwing her hands behind to catch her balance. Meanwhile, her friend sprinted towards the balcony behind us, slid the sliding glass door open, and proceeded to throw herself out of it in fear. This triggered my instincts, so I jumped up and so did the two boys beside me. We tried our best to stop her from falling over. My maid rushed in and together we hurled her backwards. My maid then grabbed her friend by the shirt, pulled her close and said, "If we are going to get through this, we are going to together." We re-entered the living room, and by this point, the woman was on her knees with her arms above her head. She began waving them madly. My maid opened the door and left, leaving her petrified friend behind with us. The woman began taunting her eyes open wider than ever. Moments later, my maid arrived with two people, an older man and a younger woman. The woman took one look at the man, and her whole face fell as she threw him the blankest stare. Then, she began to growl as he approached her and shook her head violently as if to say no. The man took the remote and turned on the TV. He played around with the channels until he found one where a priest was reading a Bible verse. The woman fell to the floor and thrashed around wildly. The man bravely walked up to her and placed a hand over her forehead, then began threatening the spirit so that it would leave. After what felt like forever, the woman fell silent again. The man then turned to my maid and her friend, who were now shaking uncontrollably, and said, "I have to spend the night here. I can't leave this woman alone with her kids. You have to leave now." The two women didn't say anything, but merely shook their heads. My maid then did something which I felt to be extremely stupid. She volunteered to spend the night with him, and her friend reluctantly agreed, looking at her as if she had gone mad. This meant that I had to spend the night too, since I didn't like sleeping alone. The night whizzed by uneventfully, and the next morning when I awoke, the house felt quiet. Just then, my maid walked into the living room with that same friend of hers and stood a few inches away from the couch. They began silently arguing with each other over something I couldn't quite comprehend, but when the argument was over, my maid was the first one to step up. She tapped the woman on the shoulder and the woman opened her eyes again. Something about her eyes told me that she had returned to her normal self, but I wasn't all convinced of this theory. The woman sat up and looked at my maid in the eye. My maid then proceeded to ask her, "Ma'am, would you like some coffee?" The woman took a few seconds to respond, but when she did, it wasn't her voice that we all heard, but a deep, gruff voice like that of a man. It echoed off the walls of the house as she said, "No." A few years later, when my maid recalled that incident to me, she then told me something that chilled me to the bone. She told me that a few months before that happened, her husband had assaulted and killed their 13-year-old daughter right before drowning himself in the bathtub. To this day, I will never understand why she didn't just move out of that house. I'm 15 years old now, and that experience still haunts me to this day.
This happened when I was about 10 years old. We were visiting my hometown, Alausi, in Ecuador, for the summer. One day, my mom and dad were getting ready to go to a wedding. My sister was already at a friend's place, so the plan was for me to stay home alone for the day. But I saw that it was a beautiful day out, so I asked my folks if I could maybe head to the park, which was just a couple of blocks away. They were reluctant at first, because there was nobody to take me there. But they were in a hurry, and I began throwing a tantrum, so they finally gave in. "Make sure you get back before it gets dark," they warned me. I ran outside, super excited, but when I got there, I was surprised to see that the park was deserted, which was weird, seeing as this was just one of 2 parks in the whole city. It should have been packed, but I was a dumb 10-year-old, and I didn't care. I ran to the swings or slides or whatever, and started to play. Suddenly, I heard a voice from the distance. I turned to see that outside the park gates, there was a strange-looking clown waving at me. He was standing beside what looked like a white delivery van. I walked towards the gate and waved back, but I didn't get too close. He asked me in Spanish, "Do you like clowns, little guy?" I shook my head and backed off. "Well, then let me see if I can change that." He opened the door to his van, and I was surprised to see only a couple of boxes inside. There was literally nothing else. No car seats, no posters and stuff. Just the boxes. Yes, suspicious. But I was a dumb 10-year-old, and I didn't care. He blew into one of those long sausage-shaped balloons, and then he twisted it up to make a balloon animal. "How'd you like that?" Pretty neat, huh? I nodded yes this time and edged just a little bit closer. When I was close enough, he handed me the balloon, and then he gave me the creepiest smile I've ever seen on a human being. It was so evil that even dumb 10-year-old me knew to back up just a little bit. If you want to see the rest of my tricks, you're going to have to come with me into the van. It'll be loads of fun. I told him that the exit was on the other side of the park and I couldn't climb over the gate. He then said something that haunts me to this day. Get a little closer. I'll carry you over. Then we can have loads of fun in my truck. Come on, kid. He still had that creepy grin plastered across his face, and finally I was a bit cautious. No thank you, sir, I said, and backed away. His grin turned into a sudden snarl of fury. Oh, but we were going to have so much fun! Right when he said that, I heard a voice on the other side of the park. Son! Son, I'm here to pick you up. I turned and saw a man that I recognized as a local neighbor. He was not my father, obviously, but the little me knew to run over to him and hold him tight. The man waved to the clown. Thanks for keeping my kid entertained. No problem, the clown replied. But as we turned around, I heard the man mutter under his breath, Sick fuck. I looked at him confused. What just happened? Who was that clown? He isn't a clown, my neighbor told me worriedly. There had been reports of a man disguised as a clown who had been kidnapping kids all across Ecuador, most of whom were never to be seen again. There had been rumors that he'd been spotted near Alausi, so the locals were on alert, which was why the park was deserted. It was sheer luck that he'd been out walking when he saw me talking to the clown and realized what was happening. It dawned on me that the man had just saved my life. Right outside my house, my neighbor turned and said, Be careful who you talk to, son. Not everyone here is who they seem to be. I gave him one final hug and ran into the house. Needless to say, I didn't go anywhere in Alausi by myself for the rest of the summer. It's been many years now, but that creepy smile on that clown's face still freaks me out every time I think about it.
This story began sometime around my junior year of high school. I was 15 years old, and in that phase of my life where I didn't listen to anyone, yet at the same time was completely impressionable. At the beginning of the year, I was sitting in my 6th period chem class, probably zoned out, looking at my phone under the clunky gray lab table, when I heard 2 people laughing to my right. The way the classroom was set up was a long rectangle, so essentially the teacher wouldn't really be able to hear what was going on in the back. The people laughing were a guy and a girl, Eric and Callie. They were somewhat popular, not the top of the food chain by any means, but everyone knew who they were. My younger sister knew Eric personally. They had a tennis match about a month or 2 earlier. Eric was really funny. That's a crucial element to this story. He was definitely the class clown. He was tall, good-looking, and extremely charismatic. I wasn't attracted to him, but I could see why everyone else was. I think it was at this point in time where I made one of the most regrettable decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to be friends with Eric. Eric was in my 2nd, 5th, and 6th periods. The next morning, I poked him in the back in Spanish class. Hey, I said, I heard my sister kicked your ass in tennis. He turned around with a goofy smile, his friends all looking at me. Who's your sister? His voice had a specific cadence to it. Karen, I replied. I don't really remember the rest of this encounter, but I'm pretty sure he denied losing the tennis match. I think the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and my day continued until I saw him in math class. Algebra 2 was one of those classes where the teacher would lecture for a while, give us homework, and then let us have the rest of the period to work on it so we wouldn't have to do it when we got home. I was looking at my paper, probably confused, when I hear a familiar voice. "Hey, girl." I looked down and saw Eric crouched to my desk on the floor. "What's up?" He started asking me about tennis, and once I said that I played, a huge smile spread across his face. I think this is when he latched on to me. He asked for my phone number and I gave it to him. That day, in our next period, he introduced me to Callie. She was older and really intimidating. I had never met anyone like her, and I was beginning to get excited at the prospect of these new interesting friends. That night he kept texting me non-stop. He would ask me questions and then would reply ha 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 to everything I said. I thought it was weird, but that was just his humor. After this day, he never left my side. We spent most of the school day together, and then would be in constant contact after school. This was 2011, so we were mostly on Facebook or doing group phone calls with Callie and 2 other friends of mine that I had brought into the group, Sasha and Natalie. There were lots of red flags. Eric wanted me to hold hands with him at school, and told everyone he had taken my virginity. For some reason, this wasn't something I got too mad about. I just thought it was weird. He would say, "Your virginity belongs to me." Again, I assumed it was a joke. I always assumed Eric wasn't attracted to girls because he said he wasn't, although he would have sex with them and tell everyone, making fun of them. He would walk down the hallway after 5th period, and he would stop for a group of freshman girls waiting for him to give them each a peck on the lips. One time we were walking to the bus, and there was a girl about 10 feet in front of us. She was cheating on her boyfriend, which I whispered to him, pointing her out. Yes, it was childish, but keep in mind this was high school, and I was 15. He proceeds to run towards her, stops her, only to point at me and tell her what I said. She came over and yelled at me, and he watched, laughing. A few months into the friendship, I began sneaking out with Eric, bringing him alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. Eric was a heavy drinker, especially considering our age. This came to a head when he asked Callie and I to come over one night. His dad was in prison and his mom was in rehab, so he lived with his grandparents. We pulled up outside his house and his car wasn't there. We waited for a while, and finally he sped into the neighborhood and stumbled out of the driver's side wasted. We followed him inside. His grandparents weren't home. I don't know what I said, but next thing I know, he grabs a knife off the kitchen counter and charges at me. I took off running and made it into Callie's car, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stares at me through the window before bursting out in laughter. My heart was racing, and my blood ran cold. Callie got into the car and we left. I don't know why I stuck around. It was almost like an abusive relationship. He told me he was the only guy who would ever find me attractive, but somehow it would turn into a joke and I would let it go. I believe the breaking point was when I heard about the baby squirrel. He had found a live baby squirrel after school and brought it home. His grandparents said they didn't want it in the house, so he walked outside and tossed it into the retention pond before walking back in. I wasn't there for that, but it disgusted me all the same. In algebra a few days later, he knocked my pen off my desk and called me a bitch. "Eric, I don't want to be friends with you anymore," I told him firmly. "Don't talk to me." His head snapped back, and he moved to the desk in front of mine. "You won't be able to ignore me," he laughed. "I know where to find you." "I'm going to college next year," I reminded him. "You'll never be able to get away from me." "Are you threatening me?" "Yes." I know this sounds like a cheesy horror movie, but that was our exchange word for word. The next week was endless phone calls, and him trying to get me to talk to him at school. At first it was jovial, when he thought I was going to change my mind. Then he came up to me in math class and opened his backpack. Inside there were several large kitchen knives. "In case there's a zombie attack." Another big smile. I should have told the teacher at that point. I really should have. But it wasn't until a few days later when he pushed me too far. "I'm going to rape you, then murder you, and I'll make Natalie film it." I went to the dean's office and told them everything. I had grown up being told not to snitch, but I couldn't focus on class anymore. I had been a good kid. I'd never been in trouble, so they believed what I told them. Here's the kicker. They called him into the office and he admitted to everything. Nodded, smiling, confirming all the stories I'd told them. Dean Thomas sat me down the next day and told me that I needed to call the police. They said there was clearly something wrong with him and that he didn't get it. They put a school version of a restraining order on him. He wasn't to talk to me, and during tests he had to be taken to a separate classroom. He would do everything he could to get around those rules. He would talk about me right in front of my face, but wasn't technically talking to me. He said out loud to the class, "Some girl put a restraining order on me because she thinks I'm dangerous." The teacher laughed and said, "Doesn't she know you're joking? That's just you being Eric, right?" The backlash I faced was enormous. All of his groupies shunned and laughed at me. Even my own friends said I was overreacting. Except for Natalie. She was always intuitive, and she said he made her feel very uncomfortable, and had started following her from class to class. When his birthday came, he approached me with Callie, and Callie said, "He wants you to wish him a happy birthday." Eventually, a mutual friend called me and told me Eric had threatened to kill himself if I wouldn't talk to him again. I went back to the dean's office. This time, every dean, vice principal, and even the principal got involved. My school was big, and there were 550 kids in my class. The school year ended, and without the protection of the authorities there, I was fielding more phone calls. When I blocked his number, he would just call me on Callie's phone. He would drive around my neighborhood to see if my car was in the driveway. He even came to my tennis matches, the ones we initially bonded over. I could see his silhouette in the fence watching me. By senior year, things had calmed down a bit. His attention was elsewhere, and I had picked my classes with the dean to ensure we weren't in any together. He was still watching. I would be walking down the hallway with someone he didn't know, and all of a sudden he would be walking with us next to my unassuming friend. "Hi, I'm Eric. Nice to meet you." He told my friends he had decided to wait for me, because we were soulmates and I'd come around eventually. I graduated high school and moved out of town. I told my new college friends that if something ever happened to me, he was the one who did it. And that's all. There's no conclusion, really. Except he always knows when I come into town. I don't know how because I blocked him on everything. I suspect he still stalks my house. He's been arrested since on drug charges and a few DUIs. I'm looking at his mugshots as I write this to remember those dead eyes. Sometimes, I think maybe I overreacted. Maybe it really was all a joke.
I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, we were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were 2 other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m., and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. It was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings, but the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious, "Hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted. But before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.
This happened when I was about 8. For reference, I'm female. I grew up in an apartment complex with about 20 buildings, each around 25 floors high. Each floor had 4 apartments, which made about 2,000 apartments overall. Each building had a car park underneath, with an elevator and a flight of stairs that went from the car park to the roof. My apartment was on the 5th floor of an apartment building right in the middle of the complex. I used to take the bus home from school, and it would drop me off at the corner across from the complex. I'd cross the road and walk home. One day, I had gotten off the bus and crossed the road when I saw that some neighborhood kids had drawn a hopscotch on the footpath outside the complex. I loved hopscotch, so I dropped my bag and started playing. On my second go, a lady, she looked to be in her mid-20s, came over and asked if she could play too. I was a naturally shy girl, but I was also very polite, especially to adults. I gave her my stone and let her have a go. Once she'd had a go, she asked if her friends could play. 3 guys, all in their mid to late 20s, came over. This freaked me out. As I said, I was very shy, especially of males. I was aware that I was alone with them, and I felt very uncomfortable. I told the lady that they could play, but I had to go home. She gave me a sad look and said that she hoped we could be friends. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I was pretty scared, so I lied and I told her I would take my school bag home and come right back. I picked up my bag and hightailed it out of there. I got home and thought that would be the end of it. I was scared of getting in trouble from my parents for talking to strangers, so I didn't tell them. The next day, though, the lady was waiting for me at the gates of the complex. She said that she was very sad that I hadn't come back, and that I had hurt her feelings. I said that I was sorry, but that my mom had made me do my homework. She asked if we could play now. I looked around and saw her friends waiting by a van. She said that they wanted to take me to have ice cream at Kiki's. Kiki's was a new ice cream place that had just opened. Each ice cream came with a toy, and all my friends at school had at least 2 toys each. We couldn't afford to go there, so I'd always felt left out. Now, this lady was offering to take me. I knew that I shouldn't go with her, so I said thank you, but that I couldn't play today. She got really angry and said that I had to go with her. Being a timid kid, I hated being yelled at, so this freaked me right out and I started to cry. The lady almost immediately backpedaled and said she was sorry and gave me a hug. Then she tried to lead me to the van, saying an ice cream would make it all better. I pulled away and started to run home, but this time, they followed me. I could hear them running after me, and I knew they were faster than me, so I figured I had to hide from them. I flew into the underground car park of the building closest to the gate and hid between 2 cars. I heard them run down the ramp and stop, and then I heard the lady call out to me. "Do you like hide and seek? Let's play. Ready? We're coming to get you." I was shivering violently and knew that they'd find me here. I decided I'd get to the elevator shaft, take the elevator up to the top, then run down the stairs a few floors and take it back down, thinking that they'd see the elevator stop on the top floor and assume I was hiding there. The elevator was on the other side of the car park. I had to go around 2 corners to get there. I crept along the wall, staying as low as I could until I was around the corner. Then I bolted for the elevator. The elevator was in a small room that had a huge door. I got inside but didn't get to close the door all the way. I pressed the up button and watched as the elevator slowly descended, stopping at nearly every floor. I crept over to the door and peeked out through the crack to see where they were. I spotted them just as I heard the elevator bing from behind me. Without thinking, I closed the door. Now, as I said before, the door was huge, so it made a huge noise as it closed, and even as I ran into the elevator, I knew they'd know where I was. The elevator was full of people, so I squeezed right to the back, hiding between 2 boys and a girl who I'd seen around before. The girl lived in my building but on a different floor. I watched the elevator doors closing, praying that they would hurry up. Just before they closed, a hand shot between them, and they opened again. The woman was there, looking furious. "Get out here!" she yelled. An elderly woman asked what the matter was, and the woman said that I was her daughter and I'd run away. I was too scared to speak, as the woman grabbed my arm and tried to drag me out. One of the boys sensed something was wrong, though, and stopped her. He asked if I knew her, and I shook my head and started to cry. The girl from my building picked me up, while the boy told the woman to leave me alone. Since the elevator was full of people who now realized what was happening, the woman and the guys disappeared. The girl from my building and the 2 guys walked me home, and told my parents what had happened. The police were called, and after some investigating, I wasn't told this until years later, found that the women and men were child traffickers. I'm so grateful that that boy realized something was off and stepped in. Who knows where I'd be if he hadn't. This happened to me earlier today, and I'm super tired, so I apologize in advance for any spelling errors. I'm a freshman in college, and my spring break had started. Instead of going to some crazy beach, I was off spending my week at home. Because winter ended so early, I found myself mowing lawns about a month earlier than usual. I drove to an elderly woman's house to mow. I had mowed her house for about 4 years now. I used to live down the street from her, but I had since moved away. I kept the job because mowing is great money for little work. She had been diagnosed with cancer, and has not been doing well. She's been in and out of the hospital, so I knew how to let myself into the garage through the back to open the garage door. I did a once-over around the outside of the house, picking up sticks and lifting up downspouts. I even threw a muddy Nerf football back into the neighbor's yard. I went back into the front yard, and it was a beautiful day outside. I had lived here for my whole childhood, so I stood out in the driveway, taking it all in. There was a couple playing tennis on a court. A few people were by their cars in the parking lot of the park, and everything else was so peaceful and quiet. A perfect afternoon, so I didn't think anything like this would happen. I saw my old next-door neighbor outside, and being the socially awkward penguin I am, I wanted to avoid conversation. I pulled the cord and started the mower on the second try, popping in my headphones and pushing it into the backyard. It was a big backyard with 3 trees, 2 gardens, and an oddly shaped bench that was extremely hard to maneuver around. I was at least used to these things, having dealt with them for years, and I was just getting into my groove when I saw a kid out of the corner of my eye. He was just standing in the backyard. I don't know how long he had been there, or how he had even made his way without me seeing him. I jumped, as I was not used to being disturbed while I mowed the lawn. I pulled my headphones out, and he just looks at me from across the yard. He looked pretty normal from where I was standing. It seemed a little hot to be wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, but I didn't think anything of it. He was a male, looked to be about 13 years old, but I don't know, I'm horrible with guessing ages. I looked at him for a couple seconds before I realized he wasn't going to say anything this far away, so I reluctantly turned off the mower. My senses were already working overtime, besides the ringing in my ears, when the kid asked,
"Can you help us?"
Us? I think to myself, there's more than one? I get the butterflies in my stomach because my keys, my wallet, and my cell phone were left out in the garage. I wanted to reduce my pocket weight. I hurried to the front, and there was a second boy there, younger than the first by a few years. He didn't move his feet, and just kept his eyes on me. I honestly didn't care about how they were standing or looking. I made a beeline for my valuables and made sure nothing was taken. I turned around with everything sorted out in my pockets, and I almost jumped again. They had closed in on me, and they were looking up at me. That's when I saw that they had these fucking huge black eyes. I felt so small, so mortal. Those eyes. That's all it took for me to realize I wasn't as in charge as I thought I was.
"Can you help us?"
The older boy asked again.
"We're thirsty, and our dad wants to know where we are."
My head is just spinning. I've read the stories before, and I know what they're up to, but I can't hide. It isn't my house. There's a water fountain just across the street, and you can use my cell phone if you want. I already know what they're going to say.
"Just please let us inside. We've been outside all day, and we were very thirsty." "You need to let us in."
I said no. I was trying so hard not to look them in the eyes. I know I shouldn't, but I wanted to learn more. I wanted to describe them, so I just caught a glimpse of the little ones. Pitch black, unblinking. I immediately thought I could hear his voice in my head, even though I had never heard it. It was almost as if I was arguing with myself. I was fighting the voice as I was slowly taking steps back in the garage. The kids didn't move forward, and they didn't say anything else. They just stared, and I kept walking, 1 foot at a time. Finally, I was close enough to hit the button to close the garage door. I could still see their feet, unmoving as the door slowly closed down, forcing me into the darkness. For about 3 seconds, I was relieved that I had escaped. Then, I realized that I was trapped. I couldn't get to the main door of the lady's house, and I couldn't go back out the front. The only option was to leave through the back door that is always left unlocked, the one that I had come through earlier. I quickly checked for what I came in with, when I realized that my keys, which I clearly remember stuffing into my pocket earlier, are now in the palm of my hand. It dawns on me that I can't even remember it, but I almost gave them my keys. This is too much for me to handle, and the darkness of the garage isn't helping, so I open the door and the sunlight washes over me. I felt so happy. It left me unprepared for what happened next. I closed the door and turned the corner to make my way to the front, and the oldest was alone, blocking my path.
I asked nicely. Let us in.
I spun around and bolted into the backyard. I didn't look back to see if I was being chased. I ran past the tree, past the mower I had left out, and I knew that the little one would be ready to meet me around the corner. Sure enough, he was there, and this side yard was more narrow than the first. I put on a burst of speed, and I knocked the kid down. I was about to feel bad, until he tried to bite my hand as I pushed him. The little fucker tried to bite me. I ran for a few more strides, so close to my car parked on the street, when I stopped. There was no traffic. Nobody had called my name. There was no reason for me to stop. Except, I did. The little boy was crying. I had never heard somebody cry like that. It was crystal clear, like it was coming from my headphones. I turned around and he was sitting up, sobbing. I wanted to walk back and help him, apologize. I wanted to open the garage and find a way in the house to let him use the phone. I wanted to do everything in my power to help him.
Let us in. We need the house,
he said through tears. Almost brainwashed a second time by an 8-year-old. I couldn't believe it. I shook it off one last time and ran into my car. I locked the doors, and I didn't look back until I was onto a different street. I called the lady's house to tell her I hadn't finished, and that I would be back tomorrow. Thankfully, she must not have been home. At least, she didn't answer. This story happened to me when I was about 7 years old. We lived in a relatively big town in Russia. Towns, unlike villages, are known for their tall multiple apartment buildings, which I wouldn't dare call skyscrapers, but some of them have been known to go up to the 24th floor. Ours, for example, had 9 stories, and our apartment was on the 8th floor. Another detail that you need to know is that each floor had 4 apartments, 2 on each side, separated by the staircase. This separation left room for a little hallway. Some people would claim them for theirs and install a door right at the beginning of this new hallway to have extra protection for the 2 apartments on the side. Our apartment had that little extra hallway, and the door installed was wooden and old. When we first moved in, we were curious to see who our neighbors in the apartment directly to the left were. Turned out it was a family of 3, a mother and her 2 sons in their late 20s. She worked a lot to provide for her sons, who seemed very healthy, at first. Tall, lean, and talkative, although I couldn't really grasp the whole idea of addiction or drugs in general. I remember being repulsed after finding out that we lived right next to heroin junkies. They were harmless since their mother provided enough to get them what they needed. But I do remember stories of them stealing on occasion, or climbing into their apartment down from the roof whenever they forgot to take their keys. One day, I overheard a conversation that their mother wouldn't be able to make enough money anymore, so the whole family was looking for a cheaper place to stay. I can still make out this woman's facial features. She always looked so tired and sad, but still tried to smile when she saw me. Although we did not initially agree, our grandma moved into the empty apartment a couple of months later, and I started to like it more, being able to just step out of our apartment and go straight to hers. The wooden hallway door protected us from the stairway, and provided a sense of having a huge family in a huge house, even though I was the only child at the time. My parents were pretty busy people. My mom had a business, and my dad was an engineer. My grandma had already retired, but she had a good piece of land out in the village that she used for gardening, so she too was very busy to keep her crops alive, and therefore spent a lot of time away. Although I was little, I was raised to be responsible and aware. I hate stereotypes, but when it comes to crime in Russia, I must admit that a lot of them are true. The idea of having a babysitter was not widely spread until the 2000s or maybe later, so whenever my parents had to leave the house, I would have to take care of myself. Sometimes I would go and visit Grandma, but when she was gone too, let's just say I didn't complain. I would watch cartoons and talk on the phone a lot, and eat jam straight out of the jar. This day was one of those days. I turned the TV on and my private little party started. As always, I turned up the volume and attempted to sing along and dance to the music. I was all by myself and enjoying the hell out of it, until I was startled by a loud sound. The typical sound the door to my grandma's apartment made, because it was a bit old but modified from outside with some kind of a leather cushion. It provided a little more isolation, but it also made it more difficult to open or close the door. You had to pull really hard and also slam it shut. I felt a little embarrassed for my loud, goofy singing, so I turned off the TV and went to see if my grandma was already home from her garden. I knocked on her door, but I heard nothing. "Grandma?" I asked, loud so that she'd hear me coming. Nothing. I grabbed the keys for her door and opened it. "Grandma, are you home?" Even though I had a feeling that she was not home, a strange sensation crept through my body. I was completely sure that I'd heard the door slam, but nobody was there. I looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I tried my best to shrug it off as me being mistaken and went back inside our apartment to continue to sing. A couple of minutes later, I heard it again. Trying not to freak out, I turned off the TV once again and went to see if Grandma was there this time. Maybe she'd left very quickly because she forgot something and now she had actually returned. I know that's pretty stupid, but I had to calm myself down somehow. Again, nothing. She wasn't at home. I went inside again and made sure to turn our lock 3 extra times. The entrance door was wooden and kind of so-so, but the lock on it was new and had steel pipes going deep into the wall to the left, up and down. I was waiting for the 3rd time. My heart was pounding, and I could hear it beating in our quiet apartment. I was terrified because I knew that somebody was trying to mess with me. I couldn't figure out how they made the noise and who was out there, but I knew that they wanted to get inside. I heard it again, a little more quiet this time, but still loud. Terrified to even look out the peephole, I looked at our hallway once I managed to catch my breath. Still nothing. A couple of seconds after that, I gathered the courage to slightly open our door and look outside. Just like I saw through the peephole, everything was fine with the hallway. Everything was fine with our door, my grandma's door, our hallway door too. But then I looked a little closer. One of the locks on the hallway door was hanging down from the only screw left. The other, smaller one, had fallen down to the floor, and the steel latch was bent. I don't know how I didn't pee myself, seriously. I ran to the door with broken locks and tried to secure it somehow. A couple of seconds later, I realized that I couldn't do anything about it, so I ran inside and locked the door. Even though I was taught to call the police in case of an emergency, I called my friend from the same building first, hoping that her father would be there. He was. Crying and sobbing, I explained my situation the best I could, and he showed up immediately. His presence seemed to have scared whoever it was away, and I felt relieved. The locks had been destroyed, and so was our hallway door. Large enough pieces were ripped from it that it made it almost impossible to repair. Later that day, we called a door company and ordered the installation of a heavy iron door. You remember me telling you about our former neighbors? Well, apparently, the family was doing worse and worse financially, so those junkies became regular visitors at police stations for theft and other minor crimes. This time, one of them must have remembered where they used to live, so we thought that it would be easy to break in since the door in the hallway would eventually give way. I can't believe those were the same people who had acted so friendly and seemed so harmless. The man was eventually caught, but I never quite got rid of the fear of being alone in a place somebody tries to break into. I have occasional nightmares that portray exactly that.
When I was in elementary school, I had a group of friends. I can't remember all 4 of them all that well, but I remember Ginny, my best friend, clearly, and the day we went to her sleepover. It wasn't exactly a scary experience. It was just really strange. Yet I can't place my finger on why it was. I thought that maybe no sleep would be able to help me in a way, so I will try to retell what happened that day to the best of my ability without any exaggerations. Now, the 5 of us knew each other since we were small and did everything together, and we had sleepovers so often that I feel like I had several homes. However, we never went to Ginny's house for a sleepover until that day. It took us years for her to agree on it. She always said that her parents were strict and stuff, but according to my mom, they seemed pretty easygoing. I always thought she was the one avoiding it because she was embarrassed of her house or something, since it was pretty common for kids to sometimes feel insecure about bringing friends over. When we first came over, I couldn't understand why she didn't want us over. Her house was gorgeous, far prettier than ours. The outside of the house had a front lawn that was well decorated with flowers, and they had one of those stereotypical white fences surrounding it. We asked Ginny if she was secretly rich or something, and she just laughed. However, I didn't like the inside of the house much. It was pretty too, but incredibly bare. The house looked brand new, along with the furniture, and even the walls were flawless. The floor was also clean, which made me uncomfortable in a way, like they were neat freaks and I had to be really careful. The house was also heavily scented with the smell of those sweetened candles. It made me sick. Her parents brought us to the living room. I remember the living room clearly. It was huge, like 3 times the size of mine, but there were only a few items in it. Some couches and a rug. Nothing else. This made absolutely no sense because, well, people are supposed to have more than just some couches in their living room. We sat on the sofa, which was leather and had that brand new chemical smell to it, and then Ginny's parents handed us pizza on paper plates. It was really strange how we were eating in the living room, without a table, but we didn't question it. They tried to entertain us by telling jokes, but even as elementary school students, we weren't really interested. They resorted to asking us questions, and the whole time, Ginny said like nothing. She was usually cheerful and talkative, but in front of her parents, she seemed stiff and nervous. Or maybe she was slightly ashamed of them asking so much. After pizza, and no drinks or desserts, they finally left. Ginny asked if we wanted to play cards and stuff. Instead, another girl in our group said she wanted to watch TV because some show she liked was up, but then Ginny said she didn't have a TV. We couldn't believe it. After a lot of "are you kidding?" and "no ways," we decided to play cards, and someone brought along chips so we shared it. I had to go to the bathroom, so I asked Ginny, who then ran out of the room to tell her parents. I was utterly confused as to why she had to tell them, and even more when I heard her and her parents talking frantically before they entered the room. They looked incredibly nervous. And then Ginny's mother told me to follow her. I remember the rest as clear as yesterday. She walked down the hallway to a door, and when she opened it, there was a set of stairs leading up to a second floor. I knew nothing about house design, but to have stairs hidden behind a door at the end of the hallway seemed really weird to me. Also, the hallway was really thin, so were the stairs. At first, Ginny's mother told me it was up there and walked away. I took like 2 steps, and she came running back. She said something along the lines of, "I'll walk you up there," suddenly, in a really sweet voice that was different from her previous tone. She walked upstairs with me, to an identical hallway, and then gestured to a closed door. Now, you may not believe it, but I am being perfectly honest about what I see next. I open the door, and there is a bathroom, totally bare of anything besides a sink and a toilet. No towels, no cabinet, no cups or brushes for hygiene. Absolutely nothing. I nervously closed the door and checked that the toilet could flush before actually using it. It just seemed more like a decoration than a real one. When I opened the door, Ginny's mother was still there, staring intensely at me, and then she walked me downstairs again. The other girls had already started to change into pajamas. I asked if we were going to sleep in the living room, and Ginny told me yes. We never saw her room, and this was crazy because girls loved bragging about their rooms, and it was a given that at sleepovers we would go to each other's room. However, no one said anything, so I didn't too. We spread our sleeping bags side by side and they closed the lights. We whispered for a while in the dark, and then they fell asleep. I didn't. It was dark, but I could hear someone getting out of their sleeping bag and saw a faint outline of someone getting up. I was sure it was Ginny because no child would probably start walking around a house they've been to in the dark. I heard Ginny walk away, and after a while, I fell asleep too. I wish I didn't. There was just something honestly unsettling about the whole sleepover, and I wish I had asked her about it. I'm sure there would be a reason. The next morning I was the last to wake up, and I woke up really late, like literally the moment our parents came to pick us up. It was too doozy to change out of my pajamas, so I just threw my clothing over it. My mom greeted Ginny's parents, and then the others before we started to leave. I told her I felt really sleepy, and my mom laughed at me and just asked me how the sleepover went. I whispered that I didn't like their house, and that they were probably really poor because they couldn't afford a TV, and Ginny wouldn't let us see her room. My mom, who had no tolerance for prejudice, told me to not say such things and to continue being Ginny's friend no matter what. When I got home, I slept again, and it ended up me spending the entire day in bed. My dad was really worried when he got home and heard about me not feeling well. He checked my temperature and stuff, and I remember this strange swollen insect bite on my arm, and then later on I vomited. I can't remember anything after that, so from here on, it's what my parents said. Apparently, when my family doctor came to check up on me the next day, he said I was just hungry. My mom phoned my friends' parents and had them ask my friends about what we had for dinner that day. They all gave the same answer, just pizza. My mom was pissed off and gave Ginny's parents a long lecture about how irresponsible they were. She said that they apologized again and again. I also have to mention something weird about Ginny. After I felt better and went back to school, Ginny asked me if I remembered anything from that night, and I told her no. She smiled and told me she was sorry. Even now, I don't know why the sleepover bothered me so much, and why she said all that. But since two heads are better than one, maybe someone can tell me.
I'll start off by saying that I'm not sure if I believe in the paranormal, but to be honest, I'm not sure how else to explain what I saw. A little background information. I lived in a part of London which during World War II was bombed by the Nazis. So some of the flats and houses were destroyed, and therefore were rebuilt later on. This experience took place when I was 7 to 9 years old. I'm not 100% sure how old I was exactly, but when we moved into the flat on the top floor of a 2-story building, I was excited that we were moving into a new place. It was much bigger than where we used to live. I picked out my room, and we spent the rest of the day decorating the place to make it ours. You know, the usual stuff. Nothing really happened for about a year, but in that time, my older half-brother moved in with us, and my little brother was born. It was around this time that things were starting to get weird. I started getting this feeling like I was being watched. I was never really a socially active child, and my parents were never really comfortable with me playing downstairs with the other kids, as they didn't know any of them, and they wouldn't have a clear view of me from the flat, so I would usually play by myself at home a lot. It started out when I was playing on my own. I would get this strange feeling in whichever room I was in, but upstairs is where I felt it the most. Sometimes I would see the outline of a person in the corner of my eye, but when I would turn to look, they would be gone. Sometimes I would look thinking that it was my parents or my older brother checking in on me, or maybe playing a trick. But again, no one was ever there. I would never hear anybody approaching either. At first I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe one of my brother's horror games had scared me more than I thought. After a few months of this, I was laying in my bed trying to get to sleep. I turned over and faced my door, That was when I caught a glimpse of a head, quickly ducking out of sight behind the doorframe. I was frozen in fear, but my heart began thumping in my ears, and I began breathing heavily. After a few seconds, I got up and ran to my parents' room, which was across the hallway. I had tears in my eyes and told them that I saw something staring into my room. My mom, in her groggy state, said that I just had a bad dream and I should go back to sleep. I told her I didn't want to because I was too scared. I kept glancing behind me to the doorway of my parents' room because from there you can see into my room, but of course I could see nothing. After my mom had woken up a bit, she could see that I was clearly panicked, and she decided to let me sleep in their room for the night. The next morning, I tried to forget all about the incident, and I was starting to believe that my mom was right, and it was just most likely a nightmare. But for the next few nights, I was too scared to face my door while I was in bed, and I wasn't sleeping well. I still had that overwhelming feeling of being watched, but it was worse now. It was almost like something was staring at the back of my head. After a couple of months of not seeing anything, I kind of forgot about it and started sleeping better as well. That all came to an end when I woke up in a cold sweat. I had had a nightmare or something, so of course I made my way to my parents' room. My mom was too tired to argue with me, and my dad had already left in the early hours of the morning for his job, so she agreed to let me sleep in the bed with her as I laid there trying to go back to sleep. I pulled up the covers and glanced at the door, and there it was again, the same figure that I had seen before, except this time it lingered. I was too scared to say anything. The best way I can describe it is that it was very tall. There was only about a foot of space from the top of its head to the doorframe. It had long fingers, and it was all black. It had no discerning features. However, once my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a long, thin smile form where its face would have been. It was a truly disturbing sight to behold. I then blinked, and just like that, it was gone. This time I could feel myself having a panic attack. I didn't know what to do, so I pulled the covers over my head, moved over to my mom so my back was against hers, and tightly shut my eyes. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, my mom was waking me up for school. I told her what happened, and again she suggested that I just had a bad dream. I know that she was just trying to calm me down by trying to downplay it, but now I wasn't sure. For the next couple of weeks, I was too scared to sleep on my own. I refused to sleep in my room even with a nightlight or a lamp on. My parents gave in and said that I could sleep in their room for a while. I felt safer with my parents. However, at some point, I woke up one night and I needed to turn over. And as I did, I glanced at the doorway, and this time, I saw long, skinny fingers curling around the doorframe, slowly followed by its head. That's when I realized it was peering around the door. Again, just like last time, I stared. I blinked, and its head was gone. I felt a small bit of relief as soon as I noticed the fingers were still there, and then, shortly after, the head came back, slowly peering from around the doorframe. Every time I would blink, the head would move away, but then would come back. Terrified, I again pulled the covers over my head and shut my eyes, breathing heavily, just trying to block it all out and go to sleep. This happened for another couple of weeks whenever I would stare at the door, so I tried my best to avoid doing so. Some time passed, and I managed to keep ignoring the doorway, and I was able to sleep better. I even thought that I would be able to go back into my room. I would just give it one more night in my parents' room, and then I would go back. That night, I again needed to turn over. I had fallen asleep on one of my arms, to the point where it lost blood pressure and had gone numb, so turning over in the bed took a bit more effort. I was about halfway over facing down into my pillow, when I suddenly felt a hand, a large man-sized hand, big enough to cover the back of my head, push me down into the pillow and held me there. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream, and I couldn't push myself up. I felt like I was going to suffocate. In my head, I was screaming, begging for this hand to let me go, and after a few seconds, the hand let go and I could breathe again. I quickly turned to look, but of course, there was nothing there. I quickly woke up my mom and told her what happened. She could see how upset I was, so she held me until I calmed down. I don't remember seeing it again after that, and a year or so later, we moved to a flat that was downstairs, and I have never experienced anything like this again. It was only a couple of years ago, when I was talking about ghosts with my mother, that she remembered one night when we were living in the upstairs flat. She had fallen asleep on the sofa, which was against a wall. She had woken up and was about to head to the bedroom when she suddenly felt someone's arms grab her and wrap themselves around her chest, making it hard for her to breathe. She could hear the sound of paper crinkling under her feet, and she barely managed to choke out a whispered, "Get off!" And then whatever it was let go. When my mom looked, of course, there was nothing there, and there was no paper, so she had no idea what had made that noise. She never experienced anything like that since we moved. I realize now that this may have been why she was trying to convince me that whatever I was seeing was a bad dream, or just my imagination. I think she believed me when I told her, and I had never felt more validated about what I experienced until right then. To this day, I still remember what that thing looked like, how it slowly moved into view, taunting me, because it knew how scared I was.
I met Trent on Tinder in October of 2014. He seemed to be my type. Tall, slender, the very definition of twink. It's hard to find many feminine gay guys in the boonies of Oklahoma, so I swiped right. We started talking and set up a date. Everything was amazing for the first couple of months, until the end of the semester, when my roommates moved away. That was when he came to spend some time with me during winter break. When I started wanting to spend some more time with my family for Christmas, Trent decided to let me know that he couldn't go home because he had cut ties with his family. This was a huge red flag if I had ever seen one. But I decided to try and help him find a place to stay and then break up with him. I didn't want to make him homeless. By the time the break had ended, Trent had enrolled at my university and was staying across the hall from me. I knew that it would be awkward when I left him, but I wasn't prepared in the slightest for what was about to come. When the new semester began, he knocked on my door, complaining that he couldn't sleep in his own room for several reasons, the most frightening of which was that he was afraid that his roommates would kill him. I reassured him that those were just unreasonable thoughts and sent him back to his room. Not an hour later, Trent comes back to me, threatening suicide. I take him to the hospital, with him sobbing about how I was going to break up with him the entire time. I never told him I was going to. The next morning, I got 30 phone calls. I changed my number and blocked him on all of the social apps I use. Then he created a new Grindr account and finally coaxed me into meeting him for a conversation. I ended up taking him back because, even though he was medicated, he was still unstable. He had attempted suicide after he was released from the hospital. I had moved off campus at that point. Fast forward about 3 months, and now he's moved off campus into an apartment he can't afford. I had been trying to get him the hell out of my house because he was essentially living with me, since he couldn't just stay at his new place on campus without attempting suicide. At that point, I was in a marriage-like relationship with Trent, against my will because I was afraid to be the cause of someone's suicide. One night, I decided that I just didn't care about Trent anymore and broke up with him. This is where it gets dark. For an hour, we went around and around with me begging through my tears for him to not kill himself, and him essentially trying to force me out of his house so he could commit suicide. It came to him threatening to call the police to tell them that I was psychotic and threatening him within his own home. I left and called the police, and when they arrived, they found him attempting to blow up his entire apartment complex. When he got back, the true stalking began. I started receiving up to 50 calls in one day from numbers that would change. He was changing his number to bypass my call block. His attempts to get me to talk to him were just like before. He created several profiles under several different names on several social apps to contact me, leaving just enough information for me to deduce that it was him. His insistence that he wasn't going to hurt me crossed the threshold from creepy into almost threatening, like a come out wherever you are. The entire time, he was trying to get me alone in a room with him. I abandoned my home and moved in with my aunt 20 miles away. One night at 10:30 p.m., I received a call from the police department, notifying me that my apartment had been broken into and that I was needed to check the apartment for missing possessions. He posed as me to get the locksmith to open my door. My drive back to my apartment was through one of the worst lightning storms I've ever seen. When I got there, I had a friend with me and a baseball bat. I opened the door and noticed that things weren't missing. New things were there. Things that I didn't own. I opened my bedroom door to find Trent's phone on the charger. My bed had been stripped of its sheets. Turning to the window, I saw Trent's clothes in a pile, and that's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew he was right behind me. When I turned around, he was in my closet, hunched over and naked. He had a wild look in his eye, and yet exited the closet in the calmest manner imaginable. It was like he was a zombie, pale with rings around his eyes, unkempt hair and a blank expression. I waved my bat at him, but he seemed prepared to die. He asked me to kill him. He tried to wrestle the bat away from me. He tried to prove that he legally lived in my apartment. He tried telling me that he'd given me HIV. I eventually got him into my living room and got him to get dressed before the cops arrived. He lunged at me and the police tackled him. So unfolded the most violent arrest I had ever witnessed. No amount of tasing subdued him. He screamed, "Police brutality! I just want to talk to Brian. Why won't you let me talk to Brian? Give me 5 minutes alone with him." The stalking continued after he posted bail. The next day, he knocked on my apartment door posing as the police. He found me in my class and chased me, eventually laying hands on me, running away when I pepper sprayed him, and tried to break into my house again. He was arrested again for trespassing. I got a protective order put out against him after he posted bail the second time. That didn't deter him. He continued his calls. I finished the semester and moved back home, and began reporting every incident of him violating that order, which were numerous. He left for LA because he thinks that the order is only valid in the state in which it was issued. If he comes back, or if he's arrested in California, I'll be taking him to court.
8 years ago, when I was about 10, my family relocated to a small single-story house with the intention of renovating and flipping it. It was a heavily industrial-type area, and it wasn't originally designed to be a house. It was more of an office building. My parents converted the largest office into the master bedroom because it had a bathroom attached to it. My siblings shared another room on the outer perimeter of the house, and I got stuck with a smaller room towards the center, so there was no windows. When I first walked into the small isolated chamber I would be sleeping in, I immediately got the sense like I wasn't allowed in there. It was like I was breaking some kind of unspoken rule, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself by setting up my furniture and toys, trying my best to personalize the room and make it feel more welcoming. But the feeling just continued to strengthen. It was like I was vandalizing someone else's property. My door was open as I was finishing up, and at that moment I happened to be the only one in the house. I then heard the frantic scurrying of paws across the kitchen flooring up the hall. I'm sure most of you know the sound. I smiled and ran into the hall, because I assumed our dogs had arrived. The idea had been to keep them at our friend's place until we had a fence up in the backyard, but apparently the plans had changed. I caught the sight of a shadow figure, lurking in the corner, and then it disappeared toward the main entrance as I called out to my dog. Then the sound stopped, and at that point all I could hear was the tense silence. I looked all around, but my dog wasn't anywhere in sight. There hadn't been a sound of a door closing. I went outside and asked my parents where the dogs were, and they gave me a quick reminder that the dogs wouldn't be coming for another few days. My 10-year-old brain couldn't process what just happened, but instead of trying to explain what I had seen, I just kept quiet. I spent the night in my siblings' room, half convinced that there was an animal running loose somewhere in the house. Fast forward about 3 months, and the house was coming together nicely, and I was feeling much more comfortable in my bedroom. The strange, unwelcoming feeling had subsided, and I was actually enjoying my cavern of privacy. However, one night I woke up to the sound of whispering in my room. I sat up and paused, half convinced that I heard my own name being spoken from across the room. I then reached over and flipped on my light, but there was absolutely nothing there. I turned the light back off and settled back into bed, and I would have dismissed this altogether if not for what happened next. I heard my younger sister start screaming from her room. I followed my parents down the hall to her room, where she was literally shaking in fear. She said that someone was calling her name from near the window. She stated that someone had been taunting her, trying to get her to leave the room and head to the small pond in the backyard. She said that she had seen something looking at her through the window. My father turned on the porch light and went out back to put her mind at ease. He came back within a few minutes and said that he hadn't seen anything. A few years later, after we had long since moved out of that house, my father did confess that he had seen something out by the pond. It was an animal of some kind, and he assumed it was a bobcat. He got the feeling that he was in some kind of danger from it. He then made his way back inside. My sister then told me that she couldn't sleep for the rest of that night because she saw something with red eyes stalking around in the backyard through her window, coming into view every few minutes. Now here's where things start to get even stranger. The first two occurrences could be dismissed as imagination, paranoia, or nightmares, but even my parents began to feel uneasy after what happened next. Though they didn't show it at the time, it was in the middle of the day, and my sister and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard a thudding sound coming from across the roof. We collectively lost our minds because the footfalls were so heavy. We were convinced that a bear or something was trying to break in. We could hear the support beams in the ceiling straining under the weight. We hid behind the couch, which in retrospect was stupid. Heading down to the basement would have probably been safer if something was about to fall through our roof. When my parents got home, we didn't have to say anything because the footsteps hadn't stopped. My dad grabbed this rusty old pitchfork that he kept in the garage and went outside, ready to prod something down off the roof. He assumed that it was a dog of some kind. I should point out that our dogs weren't home that day, though I can't remember the exact reason. The only way up onto the roof was this dead tree alongside the opposite wall of the house, and my dad climbed up with no problem. But when he got to the roof, there was nothing there. Well, Nothing except for a toy horse that I had lost the first week we moved in. There was also my sister's doll that she had brought home that day. And even when my dad stomped as hard as he could across the roof, he couldn't replicate the noise that we had all heard before. My parents had the tree cut down that weekend. There were a few instances where the TV would misbehave and turn off by itself during the night, but nothing of real concern to happen until that summer. The housework was finished, and we were all getting ready to move out, as a buyer had already been found. I was playing hide-and-seek with my sisters, and had chosen this chest in the back room as the best place to lay low. There were a whole bunch of coats and boots and random things in there, and when I climbed in and hid myself among the coats, I felt my leg bump against someone else. My younger sister seemed to have the same idea as me, and was already hiding in there. I didn't want to give us away, so I didn't say anything, but instead I just carefully shut the lid. There was just enough room for the both of us. I'm not sure how long we were in there for, but I heard my older sister walking through the room looking for us a couple of times, and after a few minutes of silence, I poked my head up through the coats and cracked the lid of the chest to get some air. Through the door to the next room, I could see my sisters looking around the family room for me. Both of my sisters. I screamed and shot up so fast that I smacked my head against the chest lid, and I made to scramble out of there. And that's when something grabbed my leg. It wasn't a firm grab, but it was more of a confirmation, like something was trying to say,
I was here the whole time.
The whole chest fell forward, and I scrambled out, wailing like a siren and bawling my eyes out. When my sister saw me, they began panicking, asking why I was so bruised up. I went to the bathroom and discovered that I had scratches and bruises all up and down my arms, legs, and neck. They weren't so bad that I was bleeding or anything, but I did look like I had let someone poke at me with thumbtacks for a while. My parents were convinced that my sisters had attacked me, even after I told them that I had been in the trunk. We moved away that summer. Looking back, it's funny how quickly abnormal things like that become totally irrelevant when you get a change of scenery. Life goes on. My family and I still remember those events, but rarely ever speak of them. Not because we're afraid. It's because we don't really see much point to it. I wonder if that's how most people adapt after experiencing something they could never explain. Dismissive and indifferent. Like it may as well have never happened.
I began working at a summer camp several years ago. I had a history as a camper at this camp, and I loved the place. By the time I was 19, I had done what I never imagined I'd do, and became the camp's one and only medic. As medic, I no longer hung out with counselors and the other younger staff as much. If I had free time, I spent it helping out in the kitchen. This year, there was kind of a big turnover in staff. A longtime cook moved on from camp, and no one was hired over the year as a replacement. So come summertime, we were scrambling to find someone to cover that position. I met two of the interviewees. One a middle-aged woman who, in my humble opinion, seemed like the perfect get-it-done kind of person you'd need as a cook. The other, a tall man, mid-40s, with piercings galore, and a loud look-at-me personality. The woman I fancied was not chosen. I think my boss was upset by her surprise when she saw how small our kitchen was, 2 ovens to feed 150 people. And the camp was introduced to our new cook, Chef Vincent. Everybody loved Chef Vincent, except for me. The instant I met him, I got chills down my spine. You know when you hear a strange sound in the dark, and your body is screaming at you to run or hide or something? That's how I felt every second I was in the meal hall or the kitchen. Soon, the places that have been like a second home to me were feeling less comfortable and more get me the fuck out of here creepy. Chef Vincent was abrasive. My first time talking to him, he said something like, "That's your medic?" in response to my color-dyed hair. He tried to be fancy, but his meals were dull and soggy. After watching him prepare one, I stopped eating them altogether. I don't think the man had gone to school in his life, let alone taken a food safety course. I survived off an occasional bite of safe food on the table, like packaged crackers, bread, things he hadn't handled directly, and a storage of cheap meal replacement drinks in my room. It sucked. I'm an extremely protective person, especially of my younger coworkers who were basically family to me. Chef Vincent's kitchen staff were 16 or 17-year-olds, and I was afraid for them. I'd watch from outside the kitchen and talk to them discreetly, making sure everything was okay. Honestly, at this point I was worried that I was being unfair since everybody else loved him. Maybe I was the one being a creep. But I couldn't get over the comments he made and the way he talked to me. He would touch my shoulder and stand all tall and lean over me when he talked. He told me about his kids and how they have to stay with their grandma now, and about his many years of experience, which I always suspected were due to being a prison cook or something like that. He was extremely arrogant. I wanted to punch him, to be honest, but eventually I just stopped going in the kitchen and even stayed away from the mess hall, unless others were in there with me. If he tried to talk to me, which he did often at night on the deck, I ignored him and left the room. But I still thought I was being a bitch, to be honest. Then Chef Vincent told one of the kitchen staff to really molest that, in reference to stirring a pot or whatever. One member of the kitchen staff came to me crying about how much he was pushing them in the kitchen. Soon, all 3 kitchen staff were describing incidents of complete disrespect, his refusal to learn their names, use of inappropriate words, and calling them his little girls, and the boy, John, Jack, Jehovah, whatever. This pushed me until I told the boss about how uncomfortable this man made me. I didn't bring the kitchen staff into it, since I advised them to tell the boss on their own. Then one day, a fellow staff member came up and said that Chef Vincent said I won't stop following him and that I should be dating him. Confused and angry, I followed up with another staff member, who said the chef was talking about the camp dog. Still concerned, I continued with my day when Chef Vincent came to me and told me the story, laughing with a hand on my shoulder the whole time. I said, "You must really like me." He also made veiled sexual innuendos constantly. Oh yeah, I like things hot, and complimented me, like more than is appropriate. I got chills every time. Fuck off, dude. This has been going on for a week. In the second week, I'm asleep in the medic's cabin. It's got a bedroom separated from the rest of the office by an unlockable door, and I'm the only one who stays there. My nights are long, lots of sick campers and whatnot. This particular night, it's 4 a.m., and I've finally gotten to bed after being up for an hour with a sick kid. I'm exhausted, and I'm asleep the second my head hits the pillow. 2 hours later, I'm awakened by a loud thumping on my door. Usually staff use the walkie-talkie to contact me, even at night, so I'm pretty concerned and I crawl out of bed and head to the door. It's Chef Vincent. I hesitate, not wanting to open the door for him, so he hammers on it again. He looks angry. I'm angry. It's 6 a.m. What the fuck does he want? Finally, I open the door just a crack and look out. He's loud. I have to do laundry. My office houses the washer and dryer for the camp, because I do laundry when kids wet the beds, so every morning laundry is reserved and staff needs to ask me to use it. This particular week, we'd had water problems, and the laundry couldn't be done, so I had a lineup of camper things needing to be washed. And here he was, 6 a.m., demanding to use the thing. When I pointed out the water issues and how camper stuff comes first, he got aggressive and yanked the door open. He's big and intimidating, and I stepped backward to avoid him, and he looked at me and said, "I'm the important one around here." I went cold. It was 6 a.m. I had just been told by a creature from the depths that I, who had worked at the camp for 5 years, was unimportant compared to him. It's hard to convey body language secondhand, but he was aggressive to the degree that I flew past my usual response to this kind of situation, anger, and went straight to fearing for my safety. I can be an anxious person, but I don't get genuinely frightened by a lot other than horror movies. So what scared me more was how scared I was. Hair on end, adrenaline pumping scared. His gaze was absolutely predatory. There was nothing about his presence that made me think he saw me as more than something to be toyed with. At this point, my mouth was opening, and I knew I'd say something I'd regret saying, especially locked in this building alone with the one man who creeped the shit out of me from the second I'd met him. So I forced out one word. "Okay," and backed my way into my room. He watched me the whole time. I go to my room, and the tears push behind my eyes, but I'm too tired for them to actually come. I'm tired of this frustration, of this anger, this fear. I'd warned my boss about him. Boss was always saying, "Listen to your gut," and I was. But did they do anything about it? No. I pushed a chair against the doorknob, not knowing if it actually works to lock doors like it does in the movies, and curled up in my bed. I told my boss the following morning, and they called it inappropriate and said it wouldn't happen again, but that was all I heard of it. For the next week, I lived in constant anxiety, which meant puking a lot and hiding in my room. When he talked to me, he had a smile that would make even the most daft of people pause for concern. While before this I had attempted to be polite, I always left from then on. That week, or maybe the next, it all blurs together at this point. All of the staff were upstairs, save for a few staff monitoring kids in their cabins. I was called over by a fellow upper-level staff member, who informed me that Chef Vincent had been fired. His police check, which they hadn't decided to do until after he was hired, had come back. He didn't pass his vulnerable sector check, aka he was not allowed to work with or volunteer with kids in any capacity due to prior crimes that I'll let you mull over. Camp was effectively on lockdown while he was to vacate the premises. I lost it then. Tears came and wouldn't stop, and I couldn't breathe. My whole body went fuzzy, and as I was led out of the building by another upper-level staff member, where I managed to gargle out something along the lines of, "He made me so anxious, and no one else saw it. I'm just so relieved." The panic attack lasted for a solid 30 minutes. When I saw him exit the building with his belongings, I hid in my office. When I finally came out, he was gone. They kept this all under wraps. They didn't tell the kids the cook had gone. Didn't tell the parents, just in case something had happened. My boss didn't even tell the board of directors. It was a huge liability. Still is. And while I'm glad that my anxieties about this man were completely justified, I'm filled with anger over the fact that he was hired without a criminal record check and the fact that my feelings were repeatedly dismissed. Camp went from being the only place in this world where I felt completely safe and comfortable to a strange place where I felt like I was living a nightmare. I felt inadequate and constantly upset. It's funny how having your fears ignored can make you feel like there's something wrong with you. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I quit on account of my mental health so I could see a professional more often. I still have fears about that man finding me, which I feel is irrational because he never actually abused me or anything. He just made me shit myself with anxiety, and was incredibly aggressive and oversexual. My parents joke about it being a Cape Fear kind of situation, and laughing about it makes it feel better. But only for a little bit. I don't think anyone realizes just how terrified I was. To this day, I still am.
About 7 years ago, 3 of my friends, let's call them friends A, B, and C, were going to have a sleepover at A's house. We were all between the ages of 14 to 15. I lived with his grandfather. His grandma had passed away a few months before he was born and had lived a full life as a photographer, but she struggled and eventually died from breast cancer, which then took his mother about 8 years later. Father was out of the picture before she was diagnosed. So that particular night, his grandfather was out of town for a funeral for an old war buddy, and we had the house to ourselves. We stayed up late playing Super Smash Bros. Melee, and we all crashed at about 2 a.m. on the floor in the living room. Later that night, I woke up freezing cold, which was odd because it had been a fairly warm day, and checked the time, 4:30. I looked around and saw a red blinking light on the coffee table. I made a mental note about that seeming out of place, but I was too cold, not to mention too tired to get up, so I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wake up to A shaking me violently. I open my eyes and can tell by his face that something is wrong. I try to ask him what's going on, but he just points at the coffee table. On the table was his grandma's last Kodak camera. He tells me that it hasn't been out of his grandma's drawers since she's been dead. He's only ever looked in there. We try to blow it off. Maybe his grandpa was getting nostalgic because of his war buddy's death reminding him of his wife's death, and took it out to remember or something. B, C, and I were pretty satisfied with that, though A still had some doubts. A week goes by, and we all had pretty much forgot about that strange morning, except for A, who had been stressing out about it ever since. He decided to go get the camera's pictures developed. He calls us all the next day. I can hear his voice trembling as he begs us to hurry over. When we get there, he throws down the bundle of pictures in front of us. We flip through them, and most of what looked like some last scenic trip his grandmother took before she died. When we got to the last 3 pictures, I froze. B and C both gasped. The pictures were of us. All 4 of us captured in each picture, sleeping on the floor in front of the television. No one else was home that night. The camera had no self-timer. I still haven't been able to explain it and get freaked out when I think back on it.
A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check out our neighborhood sex offender registry, and we discovered an offender lived in our building. Not a big deal to us, as we don't have any children at the time. But I should mention that this guy was one creepy-looking dude. I'm talking about the wild hair, crazy eyes, creeper type of scary. We would see the guy walking around the building or our neighborhood every now and then. He even set up a fruit stand for a while, and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never bothered us, so we mostly didn't think about him. At the time, I was working a crazy job, where I would be at work really late every night, and have to take a taxi home. On those nights, my husband would stay up late and wait for me to get back. I was also a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted that I was leaving the office around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband heard our door handle jingling. Assuming that it was me, he got up and went to let me in. However, something made him look out the peephole first. And there he saw him, the sex offender, completely naked, standing outside our door. As soon as my husband looked out, the guy stopped jiggling the handle, looked up, and put his eyeball right up to the peephole, trying to look in, as if he could tell someone was looking out at him. Then for some reason, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did this, the guy tried to force himself into the apartment. Eventually, my husband got the door closed and called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I got the call, and I was terrified. It must have been obvious, because when we got to our building, the taxi driver asked if he could walk me to the front door. I told him yes, and then I would appreciate that, and he stood with me until my husband came outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we walked in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the door close button over and over until the elevator finally started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the sex offender was at the time, he began banging on the elevator doors trying to get in, and then we heard him go to the staircase and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, I called the cops to report the terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their car. When I explained what happened, they responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually, we moved out of the building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see the guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people walking by.
My name is Chloe, and this story happened to me 2 weeks ago. I'm 32 years old and have a 10-year-old son named Jesse. Every now and then, the company I work for requires me to travel across the state and other parts of the country to take place in important business meetings that are mandatory for me to attend. Thankfully, my bosses are understanding of the situation. Jesse's father isn't in the picture, so my work allows me to bring Jesse with me on business trips. Most of the time, we stay in a rented lodge or an apartment. A few weeks ago, I had to go on another business trip. It was out in the country, which was nice because the house me and Jesse would be staying in was a real small lodge, which was very secluded. The night before the meeting, I was on a Zoom call with my colleagues at around 10 p.m., while Jesse was upstairs playing on his Nintendo Switch. During my Zoom call, Jesse called me from upstairs telling me I need to see something. I excused myself from the call and headed upstairs. I went into his room and asked him what was wrong. He told me there was a man outside looking up into his window. I looked out into the dark field and couldn't see anything. I told Jesse I couldn't see anybody out there. He said the man walked off into the darkness as he called for me. What he said concerned me, but I had to brush it off as maybe it was a dog walker or something. I usually think rationally when it comes to things like that. I told Jesse to tell me if he sees the man again. I then returned to my Zoom call. About an hour went by when one of my bosses suggested we took a quick bathroom and drink break. Leaving the Zoom call on as we usually do, I went to put a pot of tea on and went upstairs to check how Jesse was. I asked if he was okay and if he saw anything outside. He told me he hadn't seen anybody since. I tucked Jesse into bed and went back downstairs to continue my business call on Zoom. Most of the colleagues were back on from the break, apart from a couple. One of my bosses said, "Oh, that's strange. I thought I just saw you walking around the kitchen." The laptop that I was using for the call was set on the table in the living room, which was opposite the kitchen, which also had a back door. I replied saying no, I was just upstairs. He said he was certain that he saw me walking around the kitchen. I laughed and I told him he was seeing things. My pot of tea started to boil. I had forgot about it. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed the back door was slightly open. I thought it was odd, especially being what my boss just said to me. But I chalked it up to Jesse forgetting to close the door. He was outside playing earlier that day after all. I closed it and locked the door, poured myself some tea and sat down and continued my Zoom call. About 10 minutes go by and I started to feel funny, like really sleepy all of a sudden, but it wasn't a normal feeling. I felt fine and all of a sudden I felt like I couldn't keep my eyes open. And that's what happened. I fell asleep on a Zoom call. I didn't know at the time, but I was out for about 10 minutes until I woke up to Jesse frantically pulling me, trying to wake me up. He told me there was a man outside trying to get in. I turned around. I saw a man on the other side of the back door pulling the door handle in an aggressive way. He looked furious, as he couldn't get inside. This means that what my boss said to me earlier, when he thought he saw me in the kitchen, was true. That man did get in the house as I was upstairs checking on Jesse. He must have spiked my tea, and that's what made me fall unconscious. Once unconscious, I think he was planning to enter the house and assuming the door was still unlocked to take my son away. The thought of this makes me sick to my stomach. I thank God that I noticed the door slightly open and locked it shut. This story could have had an awful ending otherwise. We called the police and they searched the area, and not surprisingly, they found no one. Jesse and I returned home after that. This incident will haunt me for the rest of my life, and Jesse's too.